English translation, 712th Contact Part 1. Wednesday, the 28th of November 2018, 9:57 hours.
There you are. Be greeted and welcome, dear friends.
Be greeted as well, Edward, my friend. I also greet you, my friend, but I want to go out right away and look at all the work you have done, after which I want to discuss my findings with you.
Of course, knock yourself out.
What do you mean by that?
It is just such a speech that we use that says you can do as you see fit without restraint, and according to your own discretion, sense, and ability.
I did not know this idiom, but I find it good according to your explanation. But now I am leaving and will come back later.
And away he goes. But that immediately brings up the question for me. How is actually the heart-hand sign to be assessed? Which the German Chancellor Merkel always makes. If you can judge that, as your father Svath could, and understood to judge from the hand and finger postures of the human beings, their character and their being, etc.
The hand, heart, and finger posture of Mrs., whom you mentioned, means the heart-shaped finger holding and the simultaneous fingertip touching of the middle and ring fingers is done unconsciously, indicates sectarianism, and also means that this person is boundlessly obsessed with domination and power, self-important, praise-seeking, unquestioningly purposeful in every respect, in her personal actions only concerned with herself and her well-being, as well as unpredictable and irresponsible in rash decisions and actions.
Thanks. I will have to remember that. And to which I think especially what you said about the last words also relates to her welcoming culture, as well as what you said about being unthinkingly purposeful in her personal actions. When I relate that to what you said to me earlier about her but explaining some more might shed some more light on it. I still have the question of how the heart-hand sign that the German Chancellor Merkel always makes is to be evaluated in even better execution and explanation. This is because, in contrast to our idiotic psychologists and other psychologists and psychiatrists, etc., by which I mean only those who know better, who complicate everything but know nothing, who are absolute rascals in this field and yet know better. You can judge this from your best professional experience and clear view and your knowledge of the finger positions of human beings. You have already proved this to me many times, just as your father Svath was able and understood to read and judge the character and nature of human beings from their hand and finger positions. So I would now like to know from you how this heart-hand sign is to be evaluated. For my part, I have learned quite a bit from Svath in this respect, precisely in relation to finger and hand postures, etc., but I think that you, as a learned person and precisely as a real expert in this field, can judge the whole thing better than I can, because I am not specially versed in this respect, but only use my learnt knowledge for my home use.
How do you always say one should not hide one's light under a bushel? You know what I mean by that? But as far as the hand and finger position of Merkel, whom you mentioned, is concerned, this is to be interpreted in terms of depth psychology. This means that all psychological and psychotherapeutic approaches must be combined, because only the values that emerge from them together reveal the unconscious psychological processes through which human behavior and experience can first be given a high status in explaining the whole of what is to be judged. The central aspect of the evaluation of what you are asking about, that is to say, the holding of the heart, as you call it, is to be sought under the surface of consciousness and the resulting thoughts and their feelings, and thus in the deep layers of the psyche, in which further unconscious processes take place that very strongly influence conscious psyche life. And when I say the conscious psyche life, then the conscious is to be understood as a thought-feeling-action factor, consequently.
Excuse me if I interrupt you, because I would like to understand what the conscious means as a thought-feeling-action factor, because when I try to comprehend these words, then I understand by it not something conscious and thus not conscious action, but simply a thought-feeling action, which is however carried out or done unconsciously and thus not consciously. Thus, for me, the conscious psyche life simply results as an independent factor, which I can only define in relation to the conscious as the existence and presence of the psyche state, which makes itself felt in such a way that out of it, As the last fact, action is taken automatically, but effectively without conscious thoughts and feelings, whereby the conscious psyche life, or precisely its conscious, only embodies the actual psyche state, but not a conscious action.
That is correct. And consequently, I can also interpret the answer to your question in the following wise. The heart-shaped finger holding and the simultaneous fingertip touching of the middle and ring fingers is done unconsciously and expresses a behavior that is supposed to conceal the attitude of an extremely strong moral wrongness. Furthermore, this is also intended to gloss over, pretend and thus prevent, conceal the hidden deep lying, domineering and guileful pretense, and also to place the whole mendacity through the heart-shaped finger holding in a light of unreserved trust, as well as unhesitating honesty and conciseness. Furthermore, the whole of this heart-shaped finger holding indicates sectarianism, and also states that this person is unboundedly obsessed with domination and power, self-important, self-laudatory, praise-seeking, and also in every respect unhesitatingly purposeful in their personal and overall environment-related actions only concerned with themselves and their well-being, and is also unpredictable and irresponsible in unthinking decisions and actions.
Thanks. I must remember that. And in addition, I think that with regard to your last words, which you said, this also refers especially to Merkel's welcome culture, through which she has caused and conjured up the streams of refugees, for which she can neither bear responsibility, nor have negative consequences for her arisen from it. Because those in bondage to her are just as stupid, primitive, and irresponsible, do not want to lose their jobs and play along with the monopoly of power. In the case of Merkel, who is obsessed with power, everything relates, as you said, to her unhesitatingly purposeful personal actions, namely that she infatuates all her followers with her suggestive behavior and makes them her slaves, who, in their lowly intelligentum, do not perceive the power game she is really running, and as a result of the dim-wittedness of her followers, basks in her own glory. If I relate this to what you told me earlier regarding her well-calculated behavior in relation to which then elevated her to the chancellorship with the help of... But let's leave that because I am interested in how it's going to go weather-wise in California when the forest fires are out. Do you have any predictive data through your apparatus yet?
Yes, and the weather conditions will be unpleasant. Because the foresight, our apparatuses have now been further developed and are now able to record specific events more than 92 days in advance, to which they can be directed. With regard to the coming natural events will be unpleasant. Of course, such events also include weather events, as our equipment also shows. Because after forest fires or other large fires, the forest fire areas or other large fire areas are flooded by rain flash floods or large rain masses, which also create small or large mud rolls. But this will not be anything unusual and therefore also not very important for the media if it happens in the Malibu and Paradise Fire area.
So first heat, forest fires, and then flash floods and waves of mud. But there is no need to be surprised, because it is actually normal that after a heat wave there will be rain. It is to be said, however, that the climate has been brought into turmoil and change by the machinations of overpopulation, which will result in many more and worse catastrophes in the future, and even worldwide, than the one that resulted from the forest fires. The greater and more extensive overpopulation becomes, the worse nature reacts to it with storms and natural disasters, because earthly humanity has still not understood that it is to blame for this as a result of the growing humanity, and that it is constantly causing more and more dangerous turmoil through its interfering machinations in nature. And the hammer is that it is still claimed that no machinations whatsoever can be traced back to the insanely increased world population, because all manipulations, dodges, maneuvers, practices, and other machinations in relation to the subversion of the laws of nature have nothing to do with manipulations regarding the destruction of the atmosphere, climate, nature, and its fauna and flora. But that is not all, because there is much more that needs to be said and that I want to take up and clarify today. For which I also want to add an overpopulation subject to what I have to say, which Occam Wolf has beamed to me. What the third millennium will now bring to the humanity of the Earth can be comprehensively predicted. For now, nothing can be changed about what will inevitably result in the future from the consequences of the overflowing overpopulation and its machinations. And this because the humanity of the Earth does not turn towards the truth of creation and its laws and recommendations, that is to say, recommendations, but continues to walk along a path of destruction and tramples underfoot what is good, better, and correct. The whole of humanity does not in any manner follow the rules of life as they exist in the creational laws, and which can be seen, grasped, and recognized in nature. Consequently, they could also be considered and understood by rationality and intellect, and thus fulfilled, but hardly any earthling is interested in this. And this only because they prefer to lead an irresponsible life of lottery, which is based on pleasure, selfishness, egoism, money-grabbing, religious delusion, and self-importance, as well as on enmity, hatred, disregard, and indifference, as well as dislike, etc. towards their neighbor. Differences of opinion, etc., have long been part of the daily disorder of the human beings of Earth. Consequently, no consensus can be found with regard to peace and freedom. The absolute majority of humanity is dominated by an all-encompassing destructive indifference, especially with regard to fellow human beings, nature and its fauna and flora, but also with regard to life, the way of life, and the entire attitude towards life in general. This also results in the fact that no thought is given to the criminal growth of the Earth's population, and the great masses are of the erroneous opinion that the Earth, its nature, the atmosphere, and the climate, as well as all life, will continue to function and continue to exist if masses of offspring continue to be conceived and brought into the world. It is also not considered in any manner that due to the growth of population, the demand for food, at present humanity is growing by around 110 million per year, contrary to the lying statistics of the world population counters, is becoming ever greater. It has already been the case for decades that China, for example, is no longer able to feed its current population of around 1.4 billion by growing food in its own country, so that for the cultivation of natural foodstuffs in Africa, South America, Europe, and everywhere else, land or also food production companies have to be bought or leased in order to be able to feed the Chinese population. India also has the same problem with its current population of 1.37 billion. And this is in addition to all the other countries of the Earth, all of which are also overpopulated, including Switzerland, which today, in 2018, has a population of around 8.64 million, and which has therefore grown by more than 4 million from 4.6 million in just 67 years since 1951. And the fact that statisticians, etc., lie in black and white that the world population is decreasing and that there are fewer and fewer births in general, not only blows the lid off all the lies, but also blows the bottom out. And the fact that everything is also calculated wrongly with the so-called world population clock is also not taken into consideration, because how else could it be that this wrongly set human counting clock calculated the world population in October 2018 with only 7.63 billion human beings, while the Plejaren precisely accurate apparatuses list every single earthling individually and give extremely precise and incontrovertible information, which on the 31st of December 2017 at midnight was the number of human beings in the world. December 2017 at midnight, an extremely correct number of 8,844,128,002 Earth humans. But the fact that according to this effective fact, pathologically, that is to say pathologically stupidly, the UNO calculates a world population growth of about 78 million human beings per year for the period 2015 to 2020, although in reality about 110 million new descendants have been brought into the world per year for years, corresponds to more than just a malicious lie, deception, and stupidity towards humanity. Or perhaps it is the case that in relation to the reality recognition of those who claim this horrendously idiotic and catastrophically primitive stupid nonsense, the intellect, rationality, and intelligentum are so minimal that they are not even sufficient to be able to distinguish between black and white. And the fact that the United Nations only expects a population of about 9.7 billion on the globe by 2050 is probably the last bullshit prognosis and humanity stupid. Insane and lying assertion that a reasonable human being can just about bear with enormous effort and hardship without immediately going crazy and wanting to fry the dog and himself in the frying pan. If these imbeciles had even one iota of intellect, rationality and intelligentum, then it would dawn on them in their empty brains that since the 31st of December 1950, from an Earth population of 2,784,382,444 at that time, this has risen to 8,844,128,002 by the 31st of December 2017 in only 67 years, which corresponds to an increase of 6,059,745,558 human beings. This is contrary to another lie claiming that only 76 more million would be added annually. And if I take the data that I have recently taken from the internet, I have to say that these claims, lies, calculations, and assumptions stink to high heaven.
Internet excerpts, falling birth rates. But fortunately, the development is not unchecked. Very gradually, birth rates are falling. Whereas around 1950, a woman had an average of 5 children worldwide, between 1990 and 1995, the average was 3. Today, it is only 2.5. The United Nations assumes that the birth rate could drop to 2 children per woman by the end of the century. Then the so-called maintenance rate, and thus a reversal point, would be reached. If the birth rate still falls below this value, as expected, the world population will slowly decline again. 20 billion human beings by the end of the century? The 11th of July, World Population Day. On the 11th of July, 1987, there were 5 billion human beings on Earth. The United Nations took this as an opportunity to introduce International World Population Day. Not out of joy, but to slow down further growth as much as possible. Note Billy, Earth's population in the middle of 1987, according to Player and Data, 5,149,979,380. World Population Clock. How many human beings are there now? DSW.org. As of the first half of 2018, there are already more than 7.6 billion human beings living on Earth, half as many as just 30 years earlier. If this growth were to continue unchecked, it would soon become very crowded on our planet. If development remains completely unchanged, there could be around 20 billion human beings by the year 2100. Population forecasts until 2100, but until that time comes, the world's population will continue to grow significantly. In 2055, there will probably be 10 billion human beings in the world, and by 2100, there will be 11.2 billion. Assuming a reasonably favorable development of the birth rate. But if the birth rate remains at today's 2.5 children per woman, there will have to be room for 16.6 billion human beings.
Well, so much for that, but then the following.
The worldwide declining birth rate is just as much an impudent lie as also the listed number of earthly human beings, which at present is only 7,630,000,000 plus some, squashed, as also the Earth's population in 2055 is only supposed to be 11.2 billion and in 2100 only 16.6 billion human beings. The fact of the whole lying process is that the world population liars can neither count the world population nor estimate it correctly because they only proceed hypothetically and thus make idiotic assumptions. Because they do not have the possibility of clear technology, by which they could register every single individual even in the last hidden corner of the earth. And what is further to be said about this relates to the fact that by all that intelligent and in reality stupidly mendacious therefore fools and therefore fantasizers of the world population counters in relation to the growth of the Earth's population, it is not considered at all that all those follies and machinations which continue to arise from the endless growth of global overpopulation make everything altogether worse and worse. This, for example, in the way that every year around, or more than, 100 million young female and male earthlings inevitably become capable of procreation, many of whom, just as inevitably, because it is natural and predetermined by nature, craft offspring, just as tens of millions of others continue to do, although they have already brought enough offspring into the world. Many simply want to expand, have their families without reason, to found families or to fulfill their wishes for children in a stupidly unthinking way, or God knows why. Simply not to use contraception, for some flimsy or completely idiotic reason, for example as a result of religious delusion, etc. with regard to the lying fantasy chronicle of the Bible. In this, the imbecile commandment in Genesis 9, one is fantasized that the imaginary Yahweh, that is to say God, invented by an insane earthling, is supposed to have said to Noah and his sons and blessed them with the words, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." And this go and multiply has been taken seriously ever since, and is still taken seriously all over the world, and has found acceptance and practice in all religions, at least with regard to its execution, and indeed among all believers who have no direct or indirect reference to the Hebrew Jewish religious book Tanakh, in which the name of God is formed as an independent word from the Hebrew consonants Jod, He, Vav. Read from right to left, it results in the tetragram, YHWH, which is by far the most common biblical proper name. Note, tetragram equals quadruple sign, designation for the four Hebrew consonants JHWH of the name of God Yahweh as a symbol of God, which is also used to ward off evil. Furthermore, with regard to overpopulation, the death rate of human beings dying naturally or as a result of criminal and warlike machinations must be considered. But this does not make the frying pan fat with regard to a population reduction, because the natural regulation is unquestionable. Because logically, in the normal case, the relevant natural law is responsible for this and also works in such a way that the relationship between dying and living is kept within a balancing framework. However, because the procreation of offspring is carried out in excess, the production or the number of offspring increases immensely beyond the normal, as a result of which the total excessively increasing overpopulation mass far exceeds the normal mortality rate to a very high degree and drives it up ever further and more precariously. And here the factor of advanced medicine plays an exceptionally large role, because through it the natural mortality rate is reduced more and human beings are cured of otherwise fatal diseases and infirmities, as they are also kept alive longer and longer through life-sustaining transplants or implants or tissues, organs, organ parts or other materials implanted in the body, as well as microelectronic devices that take over certain functions in the body. Consequently, the natural death rate, as well as the death mass resulting from wars, acts of terrorism and other crimes occurring among mankind, is far and ever further undercut by the catastrophically increasing overpopulation that is kept alive longer and longer, whereby the Earth's population grows inexorably exuberantly, resulting in more and greater and more catastrophic problems that can no longer be overcome. Through the mass of the Earth's population, the individual human being will become more and more indifferent to his neighbor and less able to relate to him, for like the mass itself, the individual earthling will become an anonymous thing and a non-existence in relation to his neighbor and fellow human beings in general, because he himself will lose his own individuality and will no longer possess any personal honor, but will only be a shadow of himself, just as he will be nothing more than a soulless robot. The ever-increasing overpopulation gives rise to ever-new ruinous machinations of various kinds in relation to nature, its fauna and flora, and for the earth itself, whereby these manipulations, dodges, maneuvers and practices are intended to satisfy all conceivable needs, desires, and the striving for luxury of the ever-growing mass of earthlings. In particular, the exploitation of the Earth's resources, which erodes and ultimately dangerously disrupts the rotation of the planet, is a major concern. These machinations relate in particular to the exploitation or plundering of the Earth's petroleum for the production of fuel for motor vehicle traffic, which has long since become rampant and has reached a norm that can no longer be brought under control, but is expanding more and more, becoming more precarious, and ultimately can no longer be managed. The unstoppable increase in overpopulation requires more and more roads, extensions to airports, railway and tram lines, as well as the associated vehicles, aircraft, railways and trams, etc., due to the rapidly increasing volume of traffic of all kinds. But the longer the overpopulation goes on, the more it becomes impossible to cope with anything at all. As a result, for many years now the roads have been crammed with cars, buses, lorries, motorbikes, tractors and all kinds of other motor vehicles that emit CO2 and thus pollute and poison the atmosphere, to the detriment of the health of human beings as well as of the whole of nature and its fauna and flora. The railway lines are overloaded with trains, trams, and the sky or airspace is also largely overloaded with aeroplanes, a dangerous traffic route that also spreads all the pollutants far and wide in the atmosphere through CO2 emissions. But the oceans are also flooded with all kinds of ships that pollute the air and atmosphere with CO2, especially large cargo and passenger ships that run on heavy oil and are enormous polluters. This is in addition to the fact that irresponsible captains and ship crews dump masses of dirty oil and all kinds of other filth into the oceans, turning them into stinking and toxic rubbish waters and causing marine life to fall ill and die miserably, or, if fishermen catch them and then bring them into the trade and use them as food for human beings, they fall ill and may die as a result. Furthermore, this also includes the mining of precious rocks and very expensive, rare earths, but especially the overexploitation of all precious metals and ores, without which there would be neither vehicles nor electronics, surgical instruments, working machines, tools, hard cash, bridges, houses and other buildings and structures of all kinds, toys, musical instruments, transport railways of all kinds, wire and steel cables and countless other things and products. All these are human achievements that are indispensable in the modern world and in the absence of which humanity would be thrown back, if not exactly to the first age of grunting and yowling, then so far back that it would have to start completely from scratch in the most primitive way. The whole of nature, its fauna and flora, and also humanity itself, are being increasingly impaired in terms of health, respiration, well-being, viability, and the necessary free living space by the ever more blatant machinations and manipulations of the catastrophically increasing overpopulation. This is because all the prerequisites for a healthy life are being destroyed more and more radically and ultimately irreparably. The whole of nature and its fauna and flora, the tiniest rivulets of water, streams, rivers and seas, as well as the air, the atmosphere, the forests, floodplains, fields, meadows, steppes, tundras, moors, swamps, meadows, fields, horticultural areas and gardens of all kinds are being horribly and irreparably poisoned by toxins. And these toxins, which are applied in ever greater quantities and ever more frequently, turning plants and living beings into poison carriers, correspond to poisons that are becoming ever more destructive and exterminating. And the dangerous substances enter all gardens, plantations, horticultural farms, meadows, fields, and forests, as well as all fresh waters and seas, which become poison pits and thus carriers of disease, epidemics, and death. This is because the toxins accumulated in them are transferred to all cultivated or naturally grown plants and poison them from the ground up. The plant world absorbs the toxins via its food and the water in which the toxins and nutrients are enriched. Although toxins can also enter the plants via the leaves and the cuticle or outer skin or bark. Even though the leaves and outer skin also have the function of stomatal transpiration or the evaporation of water via their adjustable stomata. Thus, food intake in stationary plants is different from that in the locomotory life forms of fauna and human beings, who take in their food, which is poisoned as a result of the toxins deposited in all food, through eating. What happens in and with the plant world with regard to toxin applications also results in all seas and fresh waters, in which aquatic creatures serving as human food are bred and contaminated beyond repair by toxins and thus become toxin carriers to everything and anything in the waters. Nature, its fauna and flora as well as the human beings. All living creatures that eat meat from the toxin-infested aquatic life forms pollute their bodies in a way that is harmful to their health, as also happens through the secondary microplastics that float in the water a millionth of a tiny nanoscale and are ingested by the aquatic life forms with food and are deposited in the meat. These particles mix with the food of the aquatic life forms and pass into their flesh, which in turn serves as food for other life forms, including human beings. Secondary microplastics are formed in the environment by the decomposing primary macroplastics, which are solid and insoluble synthetic polymers or plastics smaller than 5 millimeters. The brittle and decomposing microplastic creates more and smaller plastic particles in the course of the decomposition process, which also attract all kinds of environmental toxins and are eaten by marine organisms. Moreover, it can no longer be removed from the environment because there is no earthly technology or any other way to do so. Secondary microplastics, ingested by aquatic organisms through food, are formed as tiny particles in water bodies from primary microplastics, which are broken down by brittleness, after which a following decomposition of the plastic parts finally occurs. Due to the irresponsibility of human beings, the masses of plastic and other plastics are carelessly thrown away into the open air, etc., after which they enter the waters, streams, rivers, and lakes, and are ultimately washed into the oceans. The whole thing then floats through the oceans as flotsam, mainly in the form of packaging, furniture remains, building and small parts, etc., as well as kilometer-long fishing or ghost nets. The UV radiation contained in sunlight and the mechanical disintegration caused by wave movements then tear the plastic into ever smaller fragments, which in the course of time are ultimately broken down into microscopically tiny nanoparticles. The degradation of lightweight plastics by natural processes usually takes well over 100 years, some even longer, depending on how resilient the plastic is, and consequently these nanotiny plastic particles are called persistent. In some ways, the toxic substances applied throughout the world inevitably also contaminate human beings and the entire living world, so that everything and everyone is affected by the toxins and becomes sick and sickly, which means death for many. Many will therefore eventually die from it. But also the whole of nature will be affected and many genera and species of fauna and flora will be wiped out, which, according to your Pliran investigations, currently number around 29,600. Toxins are substances that not only have a sickening and often deadly effect on all life forms existing in nature, but also on human beings, and that in the tiniest quantities. But this fact is 100% irresponsibly denied to the contrary by mendacious claims of manufacturers, politicians, and health authorities. Lying claims are made, whereby all those involved in the lies collect horrendous sums for their misleading statements of lies and thereby enrich themselves, that minimal amounts of the toxins are harmless to human beings, animals, creatures, and all life forms that are important to existence, and therefore do not pose a health risk. The fundamental fact is that the toxins that are constantly being invented and produced and spread into nature, its fauna and flora, and into the atmosphere, are becoming more and more dangerous for the existence of all life forms and thus also for human beings. This is because, as I said, they turn everything on the surface of the earth, in the soil and in all bodies of water, but also the atmosphere, into carriers of poison. As a result, all cultivated natural and also wild foods are poisoned from the ground up. And as a result, human beings and all living creatures for whom they serve as food inevitably absorb the toxins contained in all foodstuffs. Also by breathing in the air, because the atmosphere is also contaminated by all the huge masses of toxins and their toxic gases. So the fact is that all poisons of any kind are deposited in all plants, fruits, hides, berries and vegetables of all genera, species and subspecies, etc., as well as in the atmosphere and thus in the air we breathe, after which they are subsequently absorbed by all life forms of all genera and species. Consequently, all existing life, likewise of all genera and species, will be contaminated with all kinds of toxins and struck with the resulting diseases, ailments, afflictions, and epidemics, whereby in the future, through all the toxins spread into the whole of nature and its fauna and flora, various types of cancer will also increase and will be the most frequent forms of disease, which will lead to the death of the human beings of the earth. And this will be so in addition to the fact that many vital life forms of the most diverse genera and species will continue to be wiped out, as has already happened in a catastrophic way and will also continue to happen in this way. And this will also happen in the future, and more, because Earth humans have become a generation of poisoners. And inevitably because the rapidly increasing overpopulation and the ever-increasing demand for food require an ever-increasing production of foodstuffs. So the growing urgency, in addition to the greed for profit of food producers and the entire bandwagon of food traders, to force and increase food production is in the foreground. And in nature, in garden farms, fields, forests, meadows and fields, etc., food, natural resources, natural products, foodstuffs and food should be produced. If foodstuffs, natural products, raw materials, edibles, food, foodstuffs, nutrients, rations, foodstuffs, nutrients, and food for the masses of overpopulation are to be produced, then this effectively requires a hellish production of ever-increasing quantities. For a long time now, the huge production of food can only be achieved by poisoning all pests with toxins that are deadly to them, but also by poisoning, killing, and exterminating all harmless and useful and even vital insects. All toxins, contrary to the false claims and lies of the manufacturers as well as the users of toxins, have a collective effect on everything that crawls and flies, as well as on all life forms involved, such as plants, animals, birds, lizards and mammals, etc., with regard to all genera and species and comprehensively in ways that are deadly or at least detrimental to health, as well as on the human beings. And not only in the last and later stages, but very early and quickly. The fact is that for decades now the enormous overpopulation can only be fed through evil Gevald measures and precisely dangerous and destructive machinations, such as the use of deadly and health-damaging poisons, through which a sufficiently high and sufficient food production can be achieved. This means that only an ever-increasing use of poisons against food pests can bring benefit to the ever-increasing food production. Whereby, however, everything in general will become ever more poisoned and bring ever worse consequences through poisoning, diseases and suffering in relation to all life. And this is also because not only the rapidly growing overpopulation requires more and more food, but also because the food producers are conscienceless and irresponsible in their aim to gain and accumulate immense fortunes through ever greater and more extensive production. However, they do not care at all that in the process they use toxic substances that are dangerous, deadly or pathogenic for all life forms, which on the one hand contaminate the food plants, and on the other hand also make human beings ill later on when they eat the plant products. Of course, it is true that pests can destroy entire harvests, so something has to be done about it. But this must not be done in such a way that not only effective pests are fought, killed, and made ill by dangerous, harmful or deadly toxins, but also many other useful life forms and even human beings. On the contrary, however, this is exactly what is being done, and life is being made ill, killed and destroyed that must be preserved, whereby the whole of poison spraying is undoubtedly proving to be a nasty vicious circle that the earthlings have created for themselves and can no longer extricate themselves from it because they continue to irresponsibly drive their overpopulation to ever higher heights. The whole thing of poison mixing and poison spreading could only end if humanity would finally radically stop and end its overpopulation growth once and for all, and then would limit a worldwide regulated birth control and thus a continuous further decrease of humanity to a reasonable level of ultimately at most 2 to 2.5 billion. The present overpopulation, as well as its masses over all the last 7 decades, has brought about a catastrophic level of toxins spreading into the whole of nature and its fauna and flora. As a result, the whole thing has already led to the irreparable and irrevocable extinction of various life forms, including species and genera that are extremely vital for all life, and this has caused serious gaps in the Earth's entire ecosystem. This already includes the entire ecological unity of all habitats, for the ecosystem is practically the ultimate for each and every one of all life forms and their possibility of life in general. The ecosystem, which is to be understood as the totality of the interrelationships between living beings and their environment and thus as the undisturbed household of nature and its fauna and flora, is founded as the smallest ecological unit of each habitat with all the living beings existing in it and inherent to it, which only guarantees the viability and possibility of life of each individual and also of all life forms in general. This vital system, however, has already been severely impaired and in part irreparably destroyed by the earthlings through their imbecilic overpopulation breeding, whereby they are now thoughtlessly and irresponsibly intending to drive everything into complete destruction in the future, through the further breeding of an even more extensive mass world overpopulation, and are also about to actually do so. Through the criminal machinations and manipulations of overpopulation, which will continue to grow unchecked and make everything much worse in the times to come. Because offspring after offspring will continue to be begotten, earthly dominion will ultimately go completely into overdrive and the whole world will fall into a hopeless chaos. And this will be the consequence because there will continue to be no worldwide, urgently necessary radical and total birth stop and no worldwide necessary rigorous birth control. This is because the irresponsibility of the earthlings argues that the whole business of having children is a private matter and has nothing to do with self-responsibility, nor with the well-being of the planet, nature, its fauna and flora, the atmosphere, the climate, with life itself, and therefore also not with the future possibility of existence of earthly humanity and of nature and its fauna and flora in general. As a result of the ever-increasing overpopulation and its predatory machinations with regard to the exploitation of Earth resources, everything will continue to increase catastrophically and ultimately lead to a disaster and an Earth-human tragedy. This is also stated by the resource calculator of the Wuppertal Institute, which for the first time raised the so-called Earth Overshoot Day on the 19th of December 1987, which was set for 1 year. This was done in order to determine a predicted Earth resource consumption for a period of 12 months. Since then, however, the massively increasing overpopulation and its machinations with regard to the exploitation of Earth resources have resulted in the date being brought forward significantly every year, because the defined amount of Earth resources is already exceeded months before the end of the defined year. As a result of which the Earth's resources continue to be exploited and consumed irresponsibly far beyond the defined measure. As I know, the International Global Footprint Network calculates every year the significant day when the Earth's resource consumption of mankind overtakes the regenerability of our ecosystems. To which, however, you said, and I agree, that this estimated regenerability is absolutely illusory. In fact, fundamentally, the present and future Earthlings are living in debt to all future generations with regard to the use of Earth resources. This year 2018, too, another record was broken worldwide, as Overshoot Day took place much earlier in practically all states, as has been the case year after year and will also be the case in the future. In 2018, for example, the resource limit was already exceeded in Europe on the 1st of August, and therefore since then people have already been living on the consumption account of the next period and thus on credit. Compared to the previous year, Earth Overshoot Day has therefore again moved to the front, as it has steadily done before, instead of the earthly overpopulation humanity having committed itself to global justice and the preservation of livelihoods. Actually, the eco account in Europe was already overdrawn on the 2nd of May 2018, whereby the reason for this lies particularly in the high CO2 emissions in the areas of energy, transport, construction, all motor sports and in industrial gardening and agriculture, as well as in the very high land use in relation to the numerically enormous cattle farming for meat production. Especially with regard to the mass production of meat for overpopulation. It is to be borne in mind that, according to your very precise clear-in data, more than 1.24 billion or over 1,240 million cattle are kept and fattened on Earth for meat production. The fact is that every time a cow burps or lets off wind, it emits methane. Methane, however, is a potent greenhouse gas that, calculated over 10 decades or 100 years, as Foth has already explained to me, heats up the climate about 27 times more than CO2 is able to do. So the huge mass of cattle worldwide is also partly to blame for climate change. But this is basically due to the machinations and manipulations of overpopulation, which continues to copulate and ensure that it continues to grow more and more rapidly. Apart from all the disastrous overpopulation machinations in relation to the enormous methane gas production by cattle, it would be particularly and especially important to curb and minimize CO2 production as quickly as possible in every possible way. However, this would require drastic measures with regard to the delusion of madness of all those Earthlings who live with the illusion that they could not exist without explosion engine vehicles, but to whom such vehicles would have to be banned and only allowed to those who need the utility vehicles. Well, I think that with regard to CO2 reduction, for example, it would be extremely necessary and particularly important for natural CO2 storage facilities to be built and for such projects to be promoted. I am thinking here, among other things, of bogs and swamps that have dried up naturally or have been stupidly drained by human beings, which would be of particular importance for storing CO2 through bog rewetting or swamp rewetting. In this respect, I am thinking of natural and anthropogenic or human influences on the carbon stocks in the soils. In particular, I believe that the re-wetting of degraded and, in my opinion, drained moor and swamp sites would be beneficial and necessary. This is because the re-wetting of peatlands and marshes would bring a lot of benefits. Because, as Spoff explained when he talked about what will happen in the future in this regard, and I can logically understand his explanations, the climate impact of peatlands and marshes is very significant. A moor re-wetting and marsh re-wetting, that is to say a water resaturation of the moors and marshes, your father Spoff explained to me, would restore their natural state and important function, because moors and marshes and the like would store carbon dioxide and thus contribute to climate protection. However, the more the water level was lowered by a natural drought or natural disaster, or by humanly stupid drainage and draining, the more the organic substances in the form of peat would be decomposed by microbial activities, or processes caused by microbes, whereby more climate-damaging carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide would be released. As I have learned from SPA, peatlands and marshes provide very important conditions that are of great significance for the entire ecosystem, and the following 5 points are particularly important in this context. If I still remember his explanations correctly, moors and swamps and the like form a biodiversity protection, which is of very special importance, because biodiversity exists in habitats which contain many specialized genera and species and which receive the necessary substances for their existence and possibility of life through the effects of water resaturation in moors and swamps and the like. Moors and swamps and the like, with their peat etc., are extremely important long-term carbon reservoirs. On the one hand, moors and swamps and the like are water escape reservoirs and thus, among other things, flood protection, as well as reservoirs and filters in relation to the water balance. Moors and swamps and the like have an effect on the local and regional climate by spreading cooling all around and acting like a cooling device. Moors and swamps and the like offer many kinds of functional areas for many life forms of various genera and species, such as living space for many life forms, for reproduction, for food and as protection, but also for the human being's recreational and adventure space. The atmosphere above bogs and swamps and the like absorbs a large part of the heat radiation that rises from the earth. But this is partly radiated back to the Earth's surface, which forms the so-called greenhouse effect. However, a distinction must be made between this natural greenhouse effect and the anthropogenic greenhouse effect or the greenhouse effect caused by human beings. Because without the natural greenhouse effect, life on Earth would not be possible. I should explain that solar radiation penetrates the outermost layers of the Earth, with the ozone layer being the most important, followed by the atmospheric layers. There is not only one of these, as is usually assumed in ignorance by many human beings, because in reality there are several. Namely the first, which is called the troposphere and which exists as the lowest layer of the Earth's atmosphere, followed by the stratosphere, which is arranged above the tropopause. Above the stratosphere in turn follows the third, the mesosphere, and above this as the fourth the thermosphere, which extends from 85 to 500 kilometers above the ground, after which then follows the exosphere. If the air is taken into account, it becomes thinner and thinner above the mesosphere because the Earth's gravitational pull weakens with increasing altitude and therefore the air particles or gas particles can hold on less and less. So the thermosphere, in which very high temperatures of up to 1,700 degrees prevail, forms a smooth transition into space over hundreds of kilometers. I must also explain, while I'm at it, that heat radiation is converted at the Earth's surface, but is emitted again by the Earth, although the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere prevent some of this heat radiation from escaping into space. If the atmosphere did not have this protective shield, the Earth would have effectively frozen into an eternal ball of ice at -18 degrees Celsius long ago. So the natural greenhouse effect is a guarantee that a global mean temperature of about 15 degrees Celsius prevails on the planet, which also ensures that life could develop at all on good Mother Earth and that it can continue to exist. Always provided that the crazy and irresponsible Earthlings do not drive everything into the ultimate catastrophe of self-destruction and destruction of the planet with their insane overpopulation. The greenhouse effect, which was caused by anthropogenic or human influence and also climate change, will also contribute to this possibility. Above all, this is caused by the overpopulation-related machinations and manipulations in relation to the exploitation and misuse of the Earth's resources. The burning of fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and natural gas, as well as the clearing of forests, are of particular importance, but also the changes in landscapes and the incorrect use of land, as well as the alteration of streams, rivers, lakes, meadows, seashores, hills and mountains, etc., have irreparably destroyed the entire course of nature and will continue to do so. Due to the inexorably growing overpopulation, whereby the planet Earth, with all the good and best possibilities of life, is ideally designed for 529 million, but at most for 2.5 billion human beings, the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere has increased very strongly in the last 150 years. Whereby, moreover, since 1950 everything has increased to excess and from then on it has become more and more overbearing. Today's global atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, which figures as the most important and most dangerous greenhouse gas, has risen from about 280 ppm Wikipedia equals parts per million. That is to say 280 CO2 molecules per 1 million air molecules, in pre-industrial times to 420 ppm, according to the figure you gave me last week, Ta. The concentration of the greenhouse gas methane, produced by intensified agriculture and livestock, especially cattle, has more than doubled since the blatant overpopulation increase from 1950 onwards according to your statement until today in 2018. As a result, the present concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is so great that far too much heat is stored, which inevitably has considerable consequences for the world climate, whereby your clear explanations and research results state, according to your explanations, that 94.7% and thus the largest part of the global warming of the last decades, especially from 1950 onwards, is due to the greenhouse gas emissions caused by human beings. This has resulted from overpopulation in terms of its further increased CO2 production machinations in relation to this, because millions of young human beings came into adulthood and so did millions of new users of vehicles with internal combustion engines, which further increased CO2 emissions, as will continue to be the case every year. This in addition to many more cattle and other animals and creatures that produce methane gas and thus also pollute and poison the atmosphere and thus the air we breathe. As you have explained, Switzerland scores particularly badly with regard to Earth Overshoot Day and resource abuse, because the Swiss Earth Overshoot in terms of resource abuse lasted only just 3 months of the scheduled year, until the set measure was already exceeded on the 7th of May 2018, and since then Switzerland has been plodding along on credit and abusing Earth resources that should not be needed until next year. If the entire world population were to live in such a way and irresponsibly squander Earth resources as the population of Switzerland does, then the Earth resources of 3 Earths would already have to be exploited today. The overpopulation itself, as a result of its gathering together in the increasingly precarious and scarce living space, will cause the Earthlings to get on each other's nerves more and more. On the one hand, this will lead to increasing quarrels and discontent between neighbors and residents, and on the other hand, contagious diseases and epidemics will spread, both old ones that will mutate and new ones. And various of these diseases and epidemics will increase in number because they will be spread by poisons of many kinds through the drinking water and the waters as well as through the atmosphere and will seriously affect the health of human beings. But also the air, the soil, the food, trees, shrubs, fields, forests, gardens, and even everything that grows in the greenhouses. And all efforts to change for the better will be in vain to counteract and stop all the evils. For they will become greater and more disastrous from day to day, even from hour to hour and minute to minute, in relation to the rapidly increasing and still exploding overpopulation. And all that has already happened in this respect and will continue to come unchecked was and is the fault, unreasonableness and irresponsibility of the human beings of Earth. And so it will also be in the future through the further irresponsible breeding of overpopulation. That which has already been destroyed cannot be resurrected, just as that which has remained intact can no longer be preserved, because all efforts in this regard will be in vain and therefore useless as a result of the overpopulation growth. Because Earth humans, due to a lack of intellect, rationality, and responsibility, do not come to the correct conclusion that only a rigorous reduction of earthly humanity can still save something. But this can only be done by a controlled birth stop of several years and a subsequent and likewise worldwide controlled and unlimited birth control. And effectively, the only correct decision is that overpopulation is radically stopped by a preceding worldwide birth stop and a worldwide following unlimited birth control. And that as a consequence, earthly mankind is reduced to a level that is in accordance with the planet and nature. And this measure must be calculated according to nature and the planet Earth itself at 529 million human beings. Whereby this number may be exceeded, but in the maximum case may not exceed 2.5 billion. These numbers, however, were calculated in such a way that this number of human beings could have existed and lived without any problems for all times according to the Earth's nutritional capacity and its entire resources. This, however, while at the present time Earth humans, who have long since overbred, have made their planet so ill, destroyed and exploited it that it is only wasting away and heading for a state that will ultimately lead to the inability of humanity to live. If it does not learn and develop reason, rationality, and sufficient intelligentum to save what can still be saved. If we look at the machinations and manipulations of the governments, as well as those of the so-called experts and scientists who deal with climate protection, then we have to conclude that all these experts are nothing but absolute incompetence. Zeros and rivets, because they neither perceive the effective truth and reality nor recognize its reality, and therefore cannot understand anything at all about what is effective. And just as they go about their lives blindly and stupidly in this way, because they are only concerned about themselves and their own well-being and financial cushion, they also hegemonically dictatorially direct the states to which they are placed and which they should actually be exemplary, supportive, and beneficial to. However, since the majority of those in power, which, according to your Pliran analyses, amounts to 98.7%, as you said the other day, lack all abilities and other prerequisites for governance, right down to the parties, there is misgovernment worldwide. Due to a lack of intellect, rationality, and intelligentum, those in charge of the governments and their vassals and the parties etc., as well as their stupid and clueless fellow roarers from the peoples, neither recognize nor understand in any way that overpopulation alone is to blame for all the processes on Earth. In nature, fauna and flora, the climate change and the resulting natural disasters, as well as with regard to all the diseases and epidemics rampant in humanity. Moreover, you clear and judge the earthly governments and their fellow howlers to be the greatest criminals in them, who bring disaster upon the earthlings, while they are cheered to the skies with praise and adulation by the ignorant masses of the populations at all times. The machinations and manipulations, etc. alone, which are carried out by the immense masses of overpopulation, will result in the fact that at 000 hours on the 31st of December 2018 the human race has increased to 8,953,851,418 human beings, which shows an increase of 109,723,416 Earth humans for the year 2017. Have arisen and continue to arise through the fault of humanity irreparable or almost irreparable destruction, annihilation and extinction with regard to nature, fauna and flora, the climate, the atmosphere and the planet itself. All this can be traced back to the machinations and manipulations of the immense mass of Earth humans, to all disasters, evils, unrest, hatred, injustice, unpeace, unfreedom, wars, crimes, and all other Ausertangen, of every kind and kind, as also in relation to climate change and the resulting enormous storms and natural disasters of many dimensions. If the irresponsible and irresponsible rulers and their vassals etc., as well as those calling themselves scientists, experts, or other know-it-alls hold climate conferences, at which the most expensive food and booze binges are probably the most important thing, then there is only a lot of stupid and imbecilic palaver, after which equally stupid and imbecilic and completely useless resolutions are passed. On the one hand, all these senseless resolutions at climate conferences etc. bring no benefit whatsoever and are just as thoughtless as other planning of all kinds, which is supposed to solve already existing and new emerging problems. And the whole thing is pointless because the 100 to 110 million mass of overpopulation, which continues to increase every year, as well as the 100 to 110 million mass of people growing up and becoming capable of procreation, are entering the cycle of progressive destruction, annihilation, and extinction on the planet. This is particularly the case, on the one hand, through the new use of millions of explosive motor vehicles that continue to come into operation, and, on the other hand, with regard to overpopulation and its increase, which is additionally continued by already older adults by means of copulation for the production of offspring. These problems alone are not considered, nor are many other urgencies, because all the climate conference participants are in no way educated in all the necessities that arise and would be necessary to bring a climate conference to the crux of the matter, from which they could work out and bring effective, helpful solutions, order and initiate what is correct, which would then have to be carried out. And in this respect, the first thing to do would be to work out and enact a worldwide legal birth stop for 7 years, after which a birth regulation for an unlimited period of time would have to be introduced to reduce overpopulation and then prevent it from reoccurring. Of course, this would also require a worldwide enlightenment of all Earth humans, and that comprehensively in a way of revealing the facts, providing solutions, unveiling and exposing the facts, informing and initiating into the truth and informing with regard to the need for insight, instructing, imparting knowledge and raising the awareness of the population. So there is a need for the instruction of the individual human beings of the earth with regard to perceiving, recognizing, building up, understanding and comprehending personal responsibility. Just as the climate conferences bring nothing in terms of ameliorative change, because only nonsensical speeches are made and moronic useless resolutions are put forward, which bring absolutely no success and thus not one iota for climate improvement, so it goes in the same way with practically all private organizations that clamor for climate salvation. This will also be the case, as you said some time ago, when in the near future new young people's groups will emerge and demonstratively demand that governments and all those responsible should do something at all to save the climate. These young groups that will appear in the near future will also only make empty and stupid speeches and demand measures to save the climate. But in their youthful ignorance, they will also not know or understand what the effective cause and the resulting machinations and maneuvers of the whole thing are. These young human beings also do not know and do not investigate these causes, but they all only see the effects and consequently do nothing to end the climate disaster, but will only lead stupid discussions and speeches, shout and scream around and do not make an effort to find the necessary solutions. So also these young human beings, like the rulers and climate conference leaders and the other know-it-alls and experts who behave arrogantly and imagine themselves to be gods, will only talk stupid and make demands without looking for the root cause of all evils, catastrophes and destructions and finding the solution to fix the whole thing. Particularly those climate conference participants who consider themselves expert scientists, but who are effectively zeros and rivets in this respect, shout for new measures to stop climate change, although this is impossible with their nonsensical demands. The fact that politicians and governments and clueless environmental organizations go along with this and howl in support of the whole thing, which can never lead to success, also proves their stupidity, lack of sense and reason and their inferior intelligentum. They too do not find the cause of the sword of Damocles that is already falling down and that for decades has been bringing evil, terror, destruction, horror, blessings, visitations, dangers, catastrophes, collapses, destructions, annihilations and extinctions. The whole of the origin of the destruction of the climate and the poisoning of nature, its fauna, flora, waters, and atmosphere will ultimately lead inevitably and finally to defeat for Earth humans. This is because all those responsible on Earth, the governments, politicians, scientists, religions, sects, various organizations, and the majority of Earth humans do not make up their minds to introduce a worldwide birth stop fixed for 7 years and then a worldwide controlled birth control in order to reduce the Earth's population and ultimately bring it back to a normal Earth-compatible level. Stupid, pompous and moronically ignorant speeches, however, lead nowhere, and all those who behave arrogantly and fancy themselves as gods do not give a thought to what the real cause of climate change is. The origin of the whole thing is undoubtedly overpopulation and the machinations and manipulations arising from it, which have led and continue to lead to all the Ausertungen that are currently and will also in the future result in ever more destructive and devastating and even deadly natural disasters worldwide. According to your explanations, the groups of young human beings who will soon emerge, who will cry out for climate rescue and who will talk about themselves, and who have no idea whatsoever about the real causes of climate destruction, will achieve nothing. They will not be able to do anything about the necessary measures with their stupid arguments, because they have no idea about them, just as the climate conference participants do not have a clue with their idiotic gibberish and their moronic resolutions. A positive influence on the climate can only be achieved if all toxic substances of all kinds, which have to be comprehensively destroyed, as well as the gigantic masses of CO2 and the enormous quantities of methane gas, are drastically reduced. These are precisely the substances that have a destructive, annihilating and exterminating effect on nature, its fauna and flora, the oceans and freshwaters, as well as having a detrimental effect on the atmosphere and the climate, and also on the human beings who fall ill and ultimately die as a result of all this. The fact that only a radical reduction to zero of all the countless toxins of all kinds that have been spread throughout nature and its flora can bring an initial and ultimately good success is neither recognized nor understood and consequently not even taken into consideration. Also to be mentioned in particular are the enormous masses of CO2 emissions and the huge masses of methane gas, which, together with the industrial chimney emissions, are the largest and most important destructive factors in climate change and thus effectively play the main role in the whole climate disaster or climate destruction. For this is what it is. Not just climate change, as the whole thing is deceptively and misleadingly presented to humanity by expert scientists and the irresponsible people in charge. Therefore, all explosion engine vehicles, aeroplanes and ships etc., which are operated with combustion engines and products such as petrol and diesel oil, as well as oil heaters etc., must be reduced radically, but in a sensible and controlled manner. Add to this the millions of vehicles equipped with internal combustion engines, but only stupidly used for sporting purposes and moronically used for driving around, polluting the air we breathe and increasingly affecting the climate through huge CO2 emissions. The entire quantity of all vehicles powered by explosion engines amounts to billions, which, however, contrary to reason and responsibility towards the climate, are being put more and more into circulation. As a result of which the climate and the entire environment, nature, its fauna and flora as well as the atmosphere are being increasingly polluted and destroyed. In addition, due to the increasing overpopulation, from which the whole of all evils, destructions and destructions as well as extinctions fundamentally originate, new millions of such vehicles are added every year, which lead more and more to the impairment of the climate, nature, its fauna and flora, as well as the oceans, fresh waters, and to the illness of the Earth's population as well as to the extinction of numerous vital life forms of many genera and species. Further, the entire food production is to be mentioned, which in its worldwide immense mass can only be produced by the use of chemical toxins of all kinds, be it in this respect on the one hand by food impairing and these poisoning growth stimulants, or by plant protection agents in relation to the control of pests attacking all kinds of plants, such as insects, animals or rodents, etc., but also to be protected against diseases such as fungal infestations, etc., and the more humans populate the world, the more such toxins are spread, because the endlessly growing human race needs more and more food of all kinds, as well as innumerable other necessities, the types of which it is impossible for me to list, but the production and effects of which ultimately have a destructive effect on nature, its fauna and flora, and very often a pathogenic and even deadly effect on human beings. Unfortunately, the fact of our time is that not only in the great mass of human beings, but also in individual cases, two human beings can hardly or not at all talk to each other sensibly or even communicate with each other in a valuable way in the family or in a small circle. The result is that the effective truth of life and of all things is neither reasonably nor intelligently fathomed, let alone talked about or discussed at all, because already from the ground up no valuable mediation can be brought about. As a result, it has also become impossible for conciliatory mediation to take place among human beings, but rather, in relation to the increasing overpopulation, the longer, the more only unkindness, indifference, enmity, hatred, violence, mistrust and envy, etc., will prevail. Inexorably, all Earth humans are becoming strangers to each other, even in their own families and in their nearest neighbors, while all the unworthy values are spreading inexorably among all Earth humans. And this results in particular from the religious and sectarian delusion of faith in God, through which brotherhood and sisterhood, peace, freedom, love and equality are preached and lied about in the foreground in everyday life, as well as in every soul-launching pad or on every pulpit of every church, in every temple, in every synagogue, in every mosque and in every other so-called house of God. This, while in reality in truth all that is babbled about corresponds only to empty phrases of no value. 16. If the whole thing is viewed sharply and correctly in a truthful manner, then it can be seen in a regrettable and frightening way that everything is just smoke and mirrors and that religions, sects and the resulting faith are fundamentally the origin of enmity, hatred, discord, lack of freedom, war, violence, discord, destruction and ruin. And this results in particular from the religious sectarian diversities of the religious and sectarian doctrines, their rituals, prayers, beliefs, views and opinions and behavior, etc. The differences in religions, sects and beliefs create discord and hatred among the believers as a result of the different religions, sects, in which leads to acts of violence, acts of terror and wars, whereby no believing human being gives even the slightest thought to reality and its truth. Consequently, no human being who is delusional about God also knows what suggestive nonsense he has fallen prey to with his delusion of faith. Every belief, especially religious sectarian belief, stands in stark contrast to real or factual reality, from which alone the concrete effective truth emerges, which alone as provable and verifiable knowledge verifies its correctness flawlessly, irrefutably, and incontestably. A belief in the truth of a thing or of anything without the immediate possibility of clear proof and thus of verification, especially with regard to a religious belief in a God or in anything else religious, is never founded in an effectively provable knowledge that can only arise from a fact of real reality. In human beings, faith corresponds on the one hand to giving up one's own thinking, one's own insights and decision-making, one's personal opinion forming and one's very own responsibility. On the other hand, the whole thing in this respect is based on the fact that, as a result of faith, primarily a turning away from reality takes place, whereby reality is no longer perceived, nor is the only truth existing in it. The result is that the necessary attention is no longer paid to effective reality and its only existing truth, but rather to the imagination or the delusion of faith that is alien to reality, which pretends to have supernatural insights and knowledge. The whole of this, and consequently the fact of faith, is thus founded in an unobjective perception of an illusion, which can only come about through a weakness of intellect, rationality, and intelligentum. I have already said once that when it comes to the empty phrases of the preachers of God being put into practice and lived, everything then evaporates into smoke and mirrors, and the whole thing turns out to be nothing more than idiotic, stupid, empty talk, from which, however, those who listen to the preachers of God make a profit. And they do this because they are considered good believers who diligently go to the house of God and listen to the word of God. After which, however, when they have to take on their daily troubles again in the everyday life of reality, they get angry about it and express and show their true outer and inner being again. And they do this by harassing, harrying, insulting and, if possible, materially damaging or even psychologically or physically injuring the enmity, aversion and hatred that blaze within them against their fellow human beings, people of other faiths, certain groups, and those who are richer and wealthier than they are, in every possible way. And the more extensive the overpopulation grows, the more human beings fall prey to these ways of life and behavior. For with the growth of the world's population, all evil happenings of all kinds expand into steadily worse consequences. For the greater the rate of overpopulation increases, the more discord and unfreedom, indifference and injustice, as well as strife, envy and ill will, hatred, enmity, and violent violence in all relationships and directions increase among human beings, from which, in the end, wars and terrorism are the catastrophic consequences. However, the growing overpopulation and the resulting machinations, manipulations and maneuvers of various kinds also bring nature and the whole earth, the atmosphere and the climate into turmoil, causing damage and destruction, as a result of which these are not only increasingly impaired in their function, but are slowly but surely irreparably destroyed and even finally annihilated and, in addition, the most diverse life forms, which are important for all life, are hopelessly wiped out. The creational natural laws and recommendations are written in the Goblet of the Truth, etc. Also in the Teaching of the Spirit as Teaching of the Truth, Teaching of the Spirit, Teaching of Life, the observance of which is of vital importance for humanity. However, only very few human beings care about this, because the great masses are not interested in it, but only in pushing overpopulation further and thus destroying the earth, its nature, fauna and flora, the atmosphere, the climate and ultimately the planet. By irresponsibly and criminally exploiting the earth's resources to the last possible usable one and thereby also throwing the earth out of balance and causing it to egg in its course around the sun. Furthermore, the forests are also being robbed, deforested, and destroyed by the machinations of overpopulation in order to satisfy all kinds of unnecessary needs of mankind. In the process, more and more fertile land is also being destroyed for housing and new workplaces, factories, roads, sports fields and amusement parks and all kinds of other unnecessary necessities, whereby the habitats of nature and its fauna and flora, and of course also for the earthlings, are becoming fewer and more precarious, just as the climate is being increasingly affected and destroyed by toxic emissions. The unstoppable increase in overpopulation brings about many other disadvantages that have an extremely negative effect on the whole of humanity, such as poverty, which is becoming ever more profound and widespread and is inexorably spreading further and further into the population. This also has the undeniable effect of making the rich richer and the poor poorer. This, however, causes ever greater and more insoluble social problems, as well as problems with regard to the livelihood and coexistence of human beings, because the wealth of some and the poverty of other human beings creates an enormous discrepancy or disproportion between the rich and the poor, as a result of which they cannot have an equal social relationship with each other. This, however, creates discord and hatred and inevitably leads to violence, which increases more and finally becomes so violent that it results in murder and manslaughter and destruction. In the world, or at least in many countries, poverty means that human beings have no roof over their heads, nothing or only scanty food, no medical care and often also no social rights. If, on the other hand, poverty is considered in Switzerland, then being poor is usually understood to mean that one's wages are not enough to cover one's living expenses. For example, that a human being cannot afford health insurance, adequate housing, or a visit to the dentist because everything is unaffordable for him or her. However, this also means that the human being living in poverty excludes himself from society or is excluded by others, which inevitably leads to a lack of contact with other human beings. Exclusion from society, however, causes a lack of perspective and promotes further and ever worse negative effects, which, however, are very often hidden. I know that in 2016, more than 1.2 million human beings in Switzerland were affected by poverty or at risk of poverty, of which 1/4 were children and young people on the one hand, and an above-average number of single parents and families with 3 or more children on the other. This also included a large number of human beings with little or no vocational training who, after losing their jobs, were inevitably unable to find new work and therefore became poor, which is now simply referred to as social recipients. However, at that time, that is to say in 2016, there were also 140,000 women and men who were probably in gainful employment, but were still considered poor and were therefore referred to as the working poor. So with regard to poverty in Switzerland, it must be said that it is absolutely not a marginal phenomenon, not even today in 2018, and not because being poor compared to earlier times, when in the strictest sense of the word it effectively meant the deepest suffering, misery in every respect, is today defined as financial destitution, neediness, lack of possessions, deprivation, lack of money or shortage of money. Today, this is defined as financial destitution, lack of possessions, deprivation, lack of money or shortage of money, poverty, social impoverishment, destitution, poverty, hardship, and bankruptcy. A person affected by poverty in Switzerland is estimated to have a maximum of 2,600 Swiss francs per month at his or her disposal, with approximately 986 Swiss francs left over in the case of low-cost housing and after deduction of the health insurance premium. This must be used to pay for food, clothing, communication, energy consumption, ongoing household management, health care, transport expenses, entertainment and education, personal hygiene, as well as any club fees and hobbies, and so on. I have experienced what poverty actually is in many countries and also realized that living in poverty means much more than having no money and not being able to afford or buy many things. Therefore, I would like to say something about this so that it is understood when a human being is considered poor. This is because it depends on which country he or she lives in, because that determines, for example, their financial means and possibilities they have with or without money. Furthermore, poverty is to be divided into different levels, which is usually not known to the majority of humanity. Consequently, I have to explain something about this as well. Material poverty in many countries, there are many poor human beings, whereby poverty for them means that they have a lack of all conceivable essential and necessary things, predominantly not enough food, no warm clothing, and no housing suitable for them. So this form of poverty also means that the human beings do not have enough money. On the one hand, this is because they do not earn enough through their work, if they have such a job, or because they are paid inferior wages, or because they are unemployed. Attention poverty. This form of poverty means that the human being receives too little attention and care, because interpersonal relationships have atrophied to such an extent that there is no longer any respect or consideration for the neighbor, and alienation from one human being to another has become the order of the day. In the last decades, an increasingly blatant emergence has been observed in this respect, an inattention and lack of attention towards fellow human beings, which is also becoming more and more widespread today and in the future, making human beings poorer and poorer in terms of good interpersonal relationships. But this also means that there are more and more poor children who, outside the parental home, are only treated lovelessly by their fellow human beings without attention and affectionate care, who are spat on and insulted, which leads to their being retaliated against or intimidated, and ultimately to rebellion and asocialism. This inevitably arises when other persons in their immediate or wider circle engage in extremely unfair and mean machinations against them, turning them into anti-socialists. In this wise, children become poor because of various negative machinations on them by known or unknown adults or even their parents, making them poor in terms of attention and care. Emotional poverty. Parents and adult relatives very often spend less and less time with their children and godchildren, etc. And in many cases it is also the case that they themselves are completely incapable of emotions, as a result of which they cannot show affection to their children and godchildren either. This means that they do not listen to the children, just as they cannot take them in their arms or comfort them when they are sad or distressed. Therefore, whenever children are neglected and left alone, we must speak of emotional poverty. As is the case with children, it is also the case with parents or other adults. For all adult human beings also have the same natural impulses within them, even if they have suppressed them in the course of their lives through all kinds of negative and evil moral precipitation and have sunk them into a deep abyss. But they continue to exist underground and can be awakened again. Sociocultural poverty at the social level. Human beings who do not conform to the sociological norm are usually excluded from society, and this norm also applies to human beings who live in material poverty. So it is that these human beings, because they are poor and have no money, etc., also do not participate in community leisure activities or cultural activities such as concerts, any other performances or events, etc., because their being poor excludes them from everything social. The most frequent cause of sociocultural poverty is also based on unemployment, as can also be the case with other forms of poverty. In various countries this is particularly the case because there is not enough work for all human beings, precisely because on the one hand the mass of overpopulation has more human beings than there are jobs, while on the other hand the countries are already overcrowded and overloaded with jobs in every conceivable possible field of work. This means that the entire infrastructure is already overloaded, precisely the necessary economic and organizational substructure that is indispensable as a prerequisite for the supply and utilization of the entire area and comprehensively for the economy of the country in question. Of course, human beings can also become unemployed because they have to leave and give up their jobs as a result of bankruptcy or other abandonment of the enterprise. But it is also the case that many human beings work diligently all day long but still do not earn enough, as a result of which their wages are not enough to feed themselves or their families and pay for everything they need. And this sometimes does not happen even if a small income is earned additionally through a side job. But even with this, the necessary allowance is still not enough to be able to pay for everything. Too little pay alone can not only be the cause of material poverty, because if additional work is done, this can also lead to human beings not being able to spend enough time with their families, which causes serious relationship problems, because too much work has to be done. So this often leads to family hardship and problems that can trigger various forms of poverty, such as problems of alienation in relation to spouses and children, which ultimately leads to the separation or divorce of the parents, as well as when money is scarce, when the wage income of one or both partners is not enough for living expenses, rent, health insurance, and all other necessities.
English translation. 712th Contact, Part 2, Wednesday, the 28th of November 2018, 9:57 hours.
These are the most important points that I wanted to address. But all that I have said is only a part of everything that still needs to be said and explained, which would go far too far today if I were to go into it any further. Basically, I would also have to raise a lot of things with regard to the fact that violence, in all its variations, is inexorably increasing as a result of the further increase in overpopulation. Thus it is growing in society, as well as from human being to human being, as well as against the authorities, the police and in acquaintances, etc., whereby, however, also in marriages and in families with children, the practice of violence is becoming more and more evil, as well as in friendships, whereby peace and the existence of communities are being destroyed in all areas.
Already together with my father's fath, you pointed out in the 1940s, as also on your own initiative in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, through circulars to governments, media, and world organizations, that the destructive machinations brought about and carried out by the inexorably growing overpopulation will result in climate change and from it tremendous natural disasters. Neither the governments nor the media, nor the various organizations you have written to worldwide, warning them that all the evils, destruction, annihilation, and extinction of living beings of every kind, as well as the streams of refugees, The poisoning of natural foodstuffs, the oceans, fresh waters, and the entire plant world, etc., will occur as consequences of the inexorably growing overpopulation. Your serious admonitions and your great efforts were, however, disregarded worldwide, and you were also ridiculed and insulted as a crazy do-gooder.
Unfortunately, this cannot be avoided, just as it cannot be avoided by righteous journalists who effectively only write the truth, whereby they too are constantly attacked and even killed, as often happens, while the unrighteous journalists are hailed to the skies, who invent and write tall tales and lied interviews, falsify and distort presented facts, as well as insert imbecilic self-interpretations into their stupid rip-off articles. I know enough of this, because many journalists have repeatedly written stupid nonsense, twisted facts and lies about me, as well as invented interviews that I supposedly gave them, but which never actually took place.
Unfortunately, you could not do anything about it, just as Guido could not when he reported a journalist in Munich who had made up and published an interview that never took place with you.
Yes, I know, and he fell between all the chairs and benches in the process and had to pay another 15,000 marks for it. Unfortunately, I could not stop him from suing the journalist in court. But something else, namely in relation to the pi number. Apparently this does not allow the Earthlings to say that it is not correct, as well as the fact that several other calculations have been made and have come to other results than have been mentioned for the pi number since time immemorial. And why I now mention this number again is because it has been brought to my attention that once again, someone or several persons want to recalculate everything and prove that the old number is correct after all, because they simply do not want to understand that it is wrong according to your statements.
You are not telling me something that I do not already know, but you should not bother about these things and also not worry about them. This is not because the whole thing is based on airs and graces of a know-it-all, and on the fact that the imagination of the persons concerned is not developed in the ability to grasp that something can also be developed to near perfection and made to work, even though it is not 100% absolute perfection. The number of a circle, pi, corresponds to a mathematical constant that has not yet been calculated exactly and precisely on Earth, which represents the relationship between the circumference of a circle and its diameter, whereby, as I have mentioned, the result calculated so far is still erroneous. This inaccuracy is, however, minimal minor, as a result of which, in every respect, a seemingly perfect and trouble-free function can take place with respect to a construction created according to the circle number pi. And this applies to all possible formulae and constructions created and made to function in calculation of this number, the number being valid for all round and circular calculations, as well as for other areas of mathematics and physics. But in order to calculate and determine the circular number pi, which in the result corresponds to absolute correctness down to the last and smallest value, an instrumentarium is required which does not yet exist in the earthly mathematical and instrumental sphere, and therefore also offers no possibility of exact precise calculation. Consequently, neither at present nor for the time being will earthly scientific mathematical experts nor know-it-alls be able to calculate the exactly accurate circular number pi.
Then something else, and it concerns a question from the Bulletin passive member readers. I was asked if you could explain what goes on in those core group and passive group members who resign after many years of membership. For once, I think an answer from you could certainly be necessary and moreover satisfactory.
As an exception, I can comment on this, but it should really only be an exception. And the following is to be explained according to our precise respective clarifications, which we are obliged to keep in our records for each individual KG member and passive member. It is a given that a fundamental mentality scheme is inherent for every single core group member and passive member, and that this also exists at present and in the future with every Earth human. This mentality scheme, which is fundamentally humanly and individually formed, also includes a collective factor, which can be influenced collectively by other individuals. This means that this part of the mentality scheme is changeable through an external influence and can orient itself according to other moments. When everything fundamentally corresponds to a different attitude, effort, direction of thinking and development. If the mentality scheme has therefore been geared towards a specific goal and has been incorporated and there is an interest, a need, a will, and a striving for the once intensively set goal, this whole can, however, through external influences, have the particular factor of the collective reshaping of individuals in such a wise that they deviate from the goal that has been predetermined and set. Or this is completely dissolved and the external influences are taken into reference and are fully aligned with. The term mentality or mentality scheme describes a predominant psychical vulnerability in the sense of a thought and behavior pattern of a person, which is contingent on consciousness and consequently determined by thoughts and feelings. If this is related to a social grouping, a population or occupational group, or to a people or an entire human race, then the mentality scheme corresponds to a cultural standard in a form of a stereotype. In relation to individual human beings, the whole corresponds to a subjective ideology, which develops as a corresponding mentality scheme on the basis of social class membership and the associated living conditions. This is then linked to a certain social situation and also to a specific mentality which is reflected in the lifestyle. Naturally and evolutionarily, not all human beings of a group, a people, or a human race develop the same mentality pattern, and this is because the formation of the mentality pattern is naturally shaped individually by each individual. However, through the special mentality schema part, which is strongly susceptible to external influences and impacts, assumptions of collective dispositions can take place, if not quite consciously, strictly and deliberately controlled, which influence thoughts and feelings and thus form the psyche in a foreign determining manner, whereby the behavior of human beings is determined in a mentality-conditioned wise. For him or her, the willful control and action with regard to the external influences and impacts with regard to the right ability to have command of, the free use of, planning and adjusting to them is just as important as the certain predispositions. The receptivity and the inner readiness for what the human being fundamentally wants to build up in himself or herself as a mentality schema and mental life and to have as corresponding behavior patterns. If not individual but collective states of consciousness are permitted and used, then uncontrollable foreign mentalities result from this, which appear as formless and externally controlled factors and produce the most diverse Außertungen behaviors stemming from having gotten very badly out of control of the good human nature. Außertungen are expressed in particular with regard to all beliefs, especially religion and sectarianism, as elsewhere with regard to political ideologies, which are extremely difficult, if at all, to determine and demarcate in their forms. If the so-called human temperament is examined, then an original characteristic is recognized in every human being, which corresponds to a physiologically explainable pronounced susceptibility to thoughts and feelings as well as all kinds of affects, whereby violent excitement and mental movements such as states of extraordinary mental tension, passions, and all sorts of possible affect acts are expressed. With regard to thoughts and feelings, among the four temperaments generally known in human beings, the cheerful can be recognized, as well as the sanguine and melancholic or gloomy. Furthermore, also the excitability with regard to the effects of the irritable, as well as the choleric and phlegmatic or the inflexible. If the concept of the mentality schema and thus also the actual state of mentality is analyzed, then everything can of course also be negatively connoted. That is to say, contrarily developed and formed instead of positively, whereby everything can then be expressed as a cliché, prejudice, or stereotype. This, while on the other hand a mentality scheme, that is to say, a mentality can be consciously accepted as the basis of behavioral norms of a human being, a social grouping, a people, or a whole humanity,
What you explain, I have understood and defined from everything that the whole thing is not only an Earth human being problem, but this also concerns you, Plejaren. I understand from your detailed explanation that you have addressed exactly that which prevents you from coming into contact with the Earthlings or other like-minded human beings. This is precisely because you too are burdened by the factor of the mentality scheme part, which can be attacked, influenced and changed by outside influences. Consequently, you, Plejaren, also run the risk of falling back into the old waters, which still prevailed with you more than 52,000 years ago. If you cannot comprehensively control, shield and protect yourselves against the Earth humans Osgartet to get very badly out of control of the good human nature, mentality, and its malicious, negative thought-feeling world as well as its radiating effects and behavior patterns.
Your statement is absolutely correct because, in fact, it is as you say. It is explanatory to say that, in other words, it results that once a mental direction has been taken and firmly fixed, a construct of thought, a direction of learning, behavior and everything in general that the human thinks of as good, positive, correct, as a creation-aligned lifestyle, humanity, righteousness, love, peace, freedom and justice, etc. has been worked out, affected, created, trained, brought about and achieved as a culmination point and behavior to the state of life behavior, very quickly becomes completely void again if conscious control and prevention fails. This is seen solely in terms of the external influences on the mentality schema part, which as a collective factor is influenceable and changeable. And the whole of this corresponds to the same factor as is inherent in us, Plejaren. Consequently, we too, like Earth humans, are susceptible to outside influences. Consequently, we must, as I have already explained to you in another conversation, protect ourselves from the very negative and destructive mental influences of Earth humans and must not cultivate any contacts with them. But such a prevention of contact among Earth humans themselves is not possible for them. Consequently, only the possibility of learning exists for them, namely with regard to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life, and its behavioral implementation in daily life. So they must constantly orient themselves consciously, concentratedly and powerfully towards it, and must not allow themselves to be distracted from it. Otherwise, the negative external influences of the Earth's population on the factor of the mentality scheme part will tear away, invalidate and destroy the goal of healthy, positive and righteous behavior, which they are striving for or have already achieved, and consequently there will inevitably be a fallback into all the old mentality schemes and behavior. As a result, all the old bad values of unkindness, discord, lack of freedom, violence, falsehood, self-sacrifice, and lack of self-respect break through again, as do all other injustices and unrighteousness. Inevitably, the completely wrong old forms of thought and backslide into the foreground. Whereby it must be fundamentally noted that a certain weakness of the intelligentum is also decisively involved, because the intelligentum is of enormous importance for intellect and rationality. This is because, depending on the volume of intelligentum, the measure for the general intellectual capacity is given, and thus also intellect and rationality are controlled. This also means that the ratio of the volume of intelligentum determines whether everything and anything is perceived, recognized, understood, processed correctly or incorrectly, and whether logical courses of action and behavior are then created and executed, as you yourself have often formulated in a similarly instructive manner. However, the whole thing has nothing to do with the nonsensical intelligentum quotient IQ tests, by which the intelligentum of Earth humans cannot be determined, but only their general knowledge and other education. This is not surprising because of the arrogance, ignorance, and incompetence of earthly psychologists who call themselves experts in psychology, but in reality, they are not. In their autophilia, their self-love, They live in age-created false assertions and explanations which, as a result of short-sightedness, stupidity, ignorance, lack of talent, and lack of insight have been factually established as knowledge and do not permit any further development in a matter of psychology. As usual, everything in this respect is done in such a way that the false findings are regarded and championed as the last word in wisdom, whereby these findings, however, have no substance whatsoever of real analytical findings, experiences, and also of effective knowledge. This is why earthly psychologists repeatedly make serious misjudgments, resulting in all kinds of harm to fellow human beings and the environment, up to and including evil, violence, destruction, revenge, war, terror, and even murder. Furthermore, it is to be said that the earthly psychologists, who are still extremely ignorant of psychology, are absolutely incapable of determining and distinguishing the intelligentum, and that it is therefore impossible for them to recognize a valid definition of the intelligentum and to understand it. But if I have to go into further detail in my explanation as to what the fundamental causes are for a human, being to deviate away when he or she has turned to the creational natural development of consciousness and endeavored to orient his or her lifestyle and life conduct based on the creational natural laws, but then, however, falls away from it again and relapses into his or her old, creational contrary modes of thinking, feeling, acting, behaving, and disposition, be it after days, weeks, months, years, or after many decades, then this is done out of cowardice with regard to themselves. As a result, as before turning to that which is correct, progressive, and valuable with regard to the personal development of consciousness and adherence to the creational laws, the old destructive disinterest in thoughts, feelings, actions, and behavior, etc., flares up again, and altogether everything that is evolutionary is disregarded. As a result, everything that is obstructive, harmful, wrong-headed, wrong-behaving, wrong-thinking, wrong-feeling, and wrongly influencing the psyche comes back with evil, uncontrollable force. So all the old creation contrary things break through again and once more hinder the human beings with full force in their progress of consciousness. At the same time, he or she is not even able to remember how much better their state of consciousness, thought, feeling, psyche was during the time when they followed their natural requirement for the development of consciousness. This was precisely when they detached themselves from their old consciousness evolutionless false living, which they then only suppressed from then on instead of properly dissolving, which therefore, because it continued to exist in their innermost being, fully reasserts itself again after their relapse into the old creationally contrary lifestyle and life conduct. In this respect, the intellect, rationality, and the intelligentum have an important part to play, for it is those that provide the reason for the failure of intellect and reason as a result of a weakness of intelligentum. This, however, has a negative effect on every clear and sensible thought with regard to an effort to learn and comprehend a creationally ordained, correct, and valuable wise of life and living. As a result of the weakness of the intelligentum, incorrect, non-valued thought, feeling, action, behavior patterns arise which again break through with violence and, in contrast to what was previously correct, bring to bear again to a much greater extent everything that was previously negative. As a result, the human being again lives contrary to all creational natural laws, is dissatisfied and under certain circumstances becomes a believer in God again, or otherwise rises above all creational natural laws, loses their own identity and goes along as a self-punishing coward in a life that is contrary to the laws of creation, dissatisfied and under certain circumstances severely psychologically impaired. This, while the human being, if he or she lives according to the creational natural laws, endeavors throughout their life to live out their lifestyle and conduct of life according to the creational laws with full strength, and in this respect, never to slacken in learning to expand their consciousness. Even if any external negative influences and circumstances have a harassing and depressing effect on them. But if the human being allows himself or herself to be influenced by such external and negative influences and circumstances, of whatever kind they may be, then they deviate from the positive and good path they had once taken and followed, which then happens in the sense of a personal cowardice which they direct against themselves. This corresponds to a reprehensible pusillanimity and despondency, precisely a cowardice which punishes him or her with shame in themselves and makes it impossible for them to perceive their low value in terms of intellect, rationality, and intelligentum, or even to understand why they act contrary to consistency or contrary to logic. His or her state of lack of intellect, rationality, and intelligentum in this respect does not allow them to perceive the reality of life and its truth, neither within themselves nor outwardly to the environment and to their fellow human beings. Consequently, it is impossible for the human being in this situation to perceive and effectively grasp that he or she is untrustworthy, dishonorable and disrespectful to themselves and within themselves, and makes himself or herself a weakling and a shirker before their own determinations, decisions, and fickle opinions. This, while he or she does not perceive that they also radiate the whole thing out to their fellow humans and unwillingly and ignorantly reveal themselves to them as cowards. This cowardice corresponds to an extremely negative quality by which the human being, as a result of lack of intelligentum, intellect and rationality, as well as unconscious fear not recognized by him or her, allows them to be uncontrollably dominated and cannot exercise any power over it. But this results because the human being, in their old, self-wasting state, is unable to control himself or herself, withdraws pathetically, faint-heartedly and weak-willedly into themselves, and in cowardice goes along with all their negative dispositions and wrong conduct on the path of least resistance and despondency of life. A human being who acts in this wise lives unthinkingly without respect and regard for himself or herself and tends, on every conceivable negative, evil, bad and dangerous occasion, on every happening, in every situation and situation, which may endanger him or her materially in some wise or in life and limb, etc., to a personal use of violence which goes as far as hatred, terror, war, and murder, etc.
Thanks, Ptah. That is the explanation still needed, which I also wanted to hear, which you answered in great detail and probably necessarily harshly and unvarnishedly. Thanks. But now look here in the computer, Ptah. Just a moment. Yes, here, you should read this article from the Schweizerzeit. I received it from Achim Wolf, and I will insert it in the 1st of December sign of the Times. I would like to hear your opinion then.
Ptah reads,
Frontal attack on freedom of expression Friday commentary from the 26th of October, 2018, by Ulrich Schluer, Publishing Director Schweizerzeit.
On the 10/11 of December 2018, the Federal Council wants to join a UN pact that heralds the end of democracy. It is the UN Migration Pact, a comprehensive, complicated paper that is so far only available in English. It is to be solemnly signed by the international community on the 10/11 of December at a grandiose UN conference in Marrakesh, Morocco. This migration pact is essentially based on 3 pillars. Worldwide freedom of settlement. Firstly, migration is elevated to the rank of a human right. Every human being in the world is to be granted an unrestricted right to migrate that cannot be challenged by anyone. In effect, this is a proclamation of worldwide freedom of settlement. Every human being is free to go wherever he or she wishes. Control ban. Second pillar, every state has the indispensable duty to accept migrants who want to settle on its territory. Mrs. The destination countries of mass migration, the UN never speaks of refugees in the pact. consistently only of migrants, have to prepare for arriving masses. Screening arrivals is prohibited, for the desire to be able to settle anywhere is elevated to a human right. There is no longer any question of real or feigned reasons for fleeing. Worldwide freedom of settlement applies. Every state must bow to the will of an arriving migrant. Criticism's bane. The third pillar is the most scandalous. Criticism of immigration or immigration policy is declared a punishable offense, that is to say, forbidden. A decision against mass immigration, as it has become a fact in a referendum in Switzerland, is declared an act to be punished. Such a decision is not merely not implemented, rather, those who made it have to answer for an act that is punishable. Freedom of expression is thus consistently suppressed, for the time being with regard to immigration policy, but certainly soon for other processes as well. Dictatorship of functionaries shreds democracy. The Federal Council wants to sign. Not only the fact that such a pact was created within the framework of the UN is alarming. What is even more scandalous is that the Federal Council, the Swiss government, has decided to sign this democracy-destroying document on the 10/11th of December in Morocco. According to Bern, they are not very happy with some of the formulations in the pact. And they also intend to make a public statement to that effect with a gentle verbal declaration on signing. Besides, says Byrne, the pact is not, at least not yet, legally binding. Not binding? As if one did not know what has regularly happened with non-binding conventions and UN declarations in the past. A UN commission will be appointed to the covenant. This commission will regularly review and publicly comment on compliance with the covenant by every single state in the world. Switzerland will also be accountable to this commission and must report to it regularly. The commission would then regularly pillory our country if, in the commission's view, Switzerland had not implemented certain provisions of the covenant or had implemented them inadequately. Soon international law and all the sellouts of our law, our values, our constitutional provisions, who want to subject our country to foreign judges anyway, will pull out all the stops to ensure that what is written in this UN covenant is elevated to the rank of international law, which they will then claim has a higher rank than our federal constitution. Thus, Switzerland will be shackled to this pact. It will have to sacrifice its direct democracy, unique in the world, its popular sovereignty in its entirety, to the cartel of UN functionaries and their servants in our country. Swiss signature. In addition, and this fact makes the scandal perfect, the UN Migration Pact is largely written in Swiss handwriting. Jörg Lauber, Swiss ambassador to the UN based in New York, boasts of having played a major role in bringing about the pact. Federal Counselor Didier Burkhalter, who used to be responsible for foreign policy and has since resigned, gave him this top post at the time. Our taxpayers may take note of the fact that they have to pay a top salary to a diplomat of our country who obviously does everything in his power to circumvent and undermine decisions taken by the sovereign here in our country through international channels to curb mass immigration and to expose himself to international persecution. It is to the credit of the SVP National Counselor for the Canton of Aargau, Andy Glarner, that criminal proceedings have been instituted against this despiser of Swiss law who is actively working to undermine direct democracy and the sovereignty of the people. Only the self-determination initiative will save direct democracy. It is high time that the people in the cantons of Switzerland put an end to the evil goings-on in the UN. If proof were needed of the disastrous consequences our country would have to reckon with, if it sacrificed its right to self-determination to the cartel of international functionaries, then this migration pact provides that proof. It not only institutionalizes mass immigration, it also suppresses the right to freedom of expression, a fundamental human right. Only an unmistakable yes to the self-determination initiative will put an end to the dangerous spook of disenfranchising Switzerland from internationally acting officials. Ulrich Schleuer. P.S. At the federal level, the SVP has launched a motion to prohibit the Federal Council from signing the Migration Pact on the 10/11th of December. The yes or no to this pact should be reserved for Parliament, with a decision that can be put to a referendum. The Federal Council should not be allowed to do anything on its own. Schweizerseits supports this SVP proposal, which has been well received by other parliamentary groups with a petition. 2018-15-17 by admin 26.10. 2018 source www.schweizerseite.ch.
Very interesting. But I have been aware of the draft of this UN Migration Pact for some time, as well as the unlawful and damaging machinations of the Swiss UN ambassador mentioned in this Schweizerseite article to the Swiss state as well as the Swiss population. If this UN Migration Pact should actually come into being in Marrakesh and be recognized, accepted, and contractually signed and stipulated by the Swiss delegation, then the Swiss state will be getting involved in a matter through which, in the final analysis, because various other compelling machinations will follow this UN Migration Pact in the future, the freedom of the Swiss state and its entire population will be increasingly curtailed. And as far as the negative possibilities listed in this article are concerned, these are by no means illusory, because if Switzerland enters into this pact by treaty, then this means the beginning and entry into a UN bailiwick, as is also already the case with regard to the treaty machinations with the EU dictatorship, into which country representatives have irresponsibly entered by force as a result of their cluelessness, incompetence, and in their inability to make decisions and foresight to the detriment of Switzerland and its population.
We do not want to politicize, and we do not want to interfere directly in politics, just as we do not want to be politically inflammatory. But I think that according to the freedom of expression we can and are allowed to simply say our opinion, whereby I think that we are allowed to say what the given facts are, and what can result from everything after reasonable consideration, reflection, and according to probable foresight. So, according to this article, I have thought about it and I have also made probability calculations which have shown quite great evils. The exhortations listed in the article are indeed well-founded and produced results which indicate that in the course of time everything will very probably develop and result in the way the Schweizerseite exhortations state on the one hand. But on the other hand, my calculations also showed that in the long run Switzerland and its entire population would ultimately fall under the total command of the UN and also the EU dictatorship. As a result, the state of Switzerland and the entire Swiss people would ultimately lose all freedom of action and self-decision, as well as any freedom to have their own federal constitution, legislation, penal code, and so on and so on and so on. Even the army would ultimately no longer be under Swiss law, but on the one hand under the direct command of the UN, and also in connection with the EU dictatorship. In the end, according to my probability calculations, Switzerland would be under its death throes as a result of the prevailing international law. And the death curse is effectively meant seriously, because my calculations also showed that under certain circumstances, the death penalty could be reintroduced worldwide through this UN Migration Pact and international law, as was also the case with the EU dictatorship. With and through the EU Constitution, the EU dictatorship has indeed reintroduced the death penalty for all EU dictatorship states, which can be applied again at any time, but which is concealed from the populations of the EU dictatorship states. Overall, the principle applies, as will be the case, according to my highly probable calculations, in the event of the possible establishment of global international law, that international law breaks and overrides all national law. And this is exactly what will happen sooner or later if the UN Migration Pact comes into being, whereby everything will then also apply to Switzerland and its population in the future if the responsible state leaders irresponsibly sign the UN Pact. If this were to happen, Switzerland and the Swiss people would immediately be subject to the UN Migration Pact law, as was already the case due to the governmental irrationality and self-importance of those responsible in Switzerland, who forced Switzerland under EU dictatorship law through various treaties. The UN Migration Pact law will break all national laws, including those of Switzerland, if the stupidity and irresponsibility of those responsible for it prevails under certain circumstances. Thus, in Switzerland, the federal constitution, and thus every fundamental right would ultimately be annulled, and the death penalty would be carried out again at the discretion of the international law constitution. And if this were to happen, precisely through the fault and the will of the politicians and their stupid supporters from the people who shout for it, then they would also have to take responsibility for the fact that peace, freedom, and justice in Switzerland would then also be rendered null and void. In any case, the whole UN Migration Pact violates the Swiss federal constitution, both in its current form and also if the new international law were to reintroduce and enforce the death penalty in Switzerland. Ergo, only imbeciles, pathologically stupid people, masochists, schizophrenics and suicidal people, etc. blindly trust those politicians and national representatives who are incapable of judgment and who, in their use of power, are imbecile, self-important and pathologically stupid, and plunge their states and peoples into misfortune. But also, many of the people themselves are dumber than beans and believe those misbehaving politicians and take their lies, deceptions and false machinations at face value. Reality and truth, which cannot be trusted, and whose intellect and reason as well as judgment and conscience is nothing more than a rotten waste product of their defective intelligentum. And that, of course, exactly this kind of politicians and their followers from the peoples do not want to recognize themselves as being affected, but in this respect blame all righteous politicians. Representatives of the people, rulers, citizens from the peoples, that is clear, because the guilty never want to be guilty, as is also the case with the delusional believers in God. And it is precisely in this respect that the bulk of the God believers who squat in politics and verbally throw around the man-made lies, slander and deception concerning God's word are the worst. And in this respect, there are countless rulers around the world who, as believers in God, often use God, the Holy Scriptures and the Word of God to gain political and pro-state power supporters from the populations, whereby the stupid and simple-minded then believe the seducers in a religiously appropriate manner. And therefore, it is not surprising that around the world, of all people, many rulers, politicians, and country representatives, etc. in governments and public offices are able to exercise power and make their peoples believe in false and contemptible religious roles. And what is more, they can do this even though they lack intellect, reason, and the necessary intelligentum for their office, and are therefore incapable of leading a state and its people. Consequently, the fact is that they are nothing more and nothing less than just selfish, egoistic and self-important sad characters who are incapable of any peaceful, liberal, just politics and governance, as well as of really working for the good of their states and peoples, and doing the best possible for them. But the fact is that many of these elements always put their religious faith and their God in the foreground, because they are addicted to the delusion of the holy word, whether real, alleged, or pretended for advantageous reasons, that remains to be seen. And they live in the delusion of receiving divine instructions and hearing heavenly messages. And the fact that it is these God believers, of all people, who are in power and who have no interest in or responsibility for peace, freedom, justice, and humanity, as well as for healthy and necessary measures for saving planning and action with regard to the healthy preservation and regeneration of nature, its fauna and flora, the oceans and fresh waters, the climate, the entire environment, and the earth itself, as well as its humanity, is a testimony to depravity beyond compare. But this also applies to the urgently needed and humane reduction of overpopulation through a worldwide birth stop and an inevitable worldwide birth control. But the misbehaving part of the big-mouthed people in government and politics has neither interest nor understanding for this, nor do the people who cheer them on, who all, just the misguided part of the politicians and rulers, who act just as irresponsibly as the part of the people who are like-minded and cheer them on, only live according to their personal wishes. Ideas, pleasures, wealth, individual well-being, and their degenerated pleasures. But the fact that all of them, the whole section of the fallible selfish, egoistic and power-obsessed politicians and rulers, etc., as well as the majority of the peoples in bondage to them, continue to maintain, steadily increase and further drive all degeneracy and evil in every respect and drive the entire Earth, humans as well as nature, fauna and flora, the entire environment and the planet Earth itself into a tremendous and irreparable catastrophe, is of no concern to any of them. So they continue to work thoughtlessly and irresponsibly, unstoppably, promoting and fomenting fear, discord, lack of freedom, terror, and wars all over the world and among all states and peoples. As a consequence, by that part of the politicians and rulers as well as the ignorant peoples cheering them on, who are shitting their trousers in cowardly fear of the allegedly hostile other states, military and defense expenditures are also steadily increased. The weapon potentials with the latest modern lethal weapon systems are infinitely increased, and hatred and enmity are bred up ever more vehemently. But this is not enough, because those imbeciles among the politicians and rulers, who in cowardly fear of foreign states, which are supposed to be enemies, are stirring up their peoples and additionally demanding the further expansion of their armies, or where there are none yet, that such should be brought into being and built up. And the fact that this will continue to create and spread all kinds of degeneracy, evil and terror is clear even to the most uneducated, obtuse and intellectually weakest human beings in the backwoods, but obviously not to the wrongdoers in politics and governments, nor to the great masses of human beings who think they are better than the ignorant in the bush, and who believe the populist powerful and their mendacious religious slogans, and that they are all making fools of themselves and creeping up the asses of those politicians and state leaders who are conjuring up political and governmental mischief, they do not realize either, just as they do not realize that they are living in delusion, even highly educated, knowledgeable, clever, well-versed, very substantial, well-founded, erudite, trained, informed, saddle-proof, secure, unassailable, infallible, well-informed, and reliable, but truthfully have nothing of all this, but on the contrary are absolutely more than just stupid and beanstraw stupid.
I can only judge your statements by agreeing with them. I would like to say, however, that the majority of all earthly politicians and rulers do not really know how to lead their states and peoples for their well-being. Security, peace, and freedom, but only for the sake of their own personal might and interests, and abuse their high positions for this purpose. Furthermore, the same majority is afflicted with fear with regard to other states and peoples who are expected to engage in warlike attacks, as a result of which the fear-afflicted state leaders constantly push for armament of all kinds and for great military might, which requires finances worth billions that could otherwise be used for the good of peace, useful progress, and the effective good of the peoples. And further it is to be said, without my making arrogant or demeaning insinuations or having such thoughts, that the majority of all those active in politics and government worldwide, as well as the majority of the population, even if they are considered adults in terms of age and physique, from our point of view and attitude of consciousness, reason, intelligentum, knowledge, and our perception of responsibility all in all exhibit an overall behavior which in our case is only evident in still uneducated adolescence. Real adulthood cannot simply be given according to age and physical maturity, as is wrongly understood among Earth humans, but only according to intellect, rationality, intelligentum, a sense of responsibility, and all other necessary factors that guarantee a correct, peaceful, free, and just conduct of life, as well as the ability to think, decide, and act. And these are the high values that the majority of earthly politicians, rulers, and populations lack, which is why they are incapable of correct decisions and actions with regard to peace, freedom, and justice, devise unreasonable wrong decisions, and also act accordingly, imagining that they would do good and the best in a well-considered way, but in reality create hardship and misery, strife, unfreedom, and injustice. And they do this because, As a result of misunderstandings, hatred, and fear, etc., they only create enmity towards other states and human beings, and from this, violent ideas of violence within themselves. From this, they then raise their voices and make nonsensical, fear-fueled speeches, through which suggestive and evil enmity-creating talk is created over and over again, thereby driving up the fear of enemies and ultimately provoking armed conflicts, terror, and wars.
Now you are right again, my friend. Then I can ask you now what you have in mind regarding my biography that Bernadette is writing.
I have already said that privately, and I have also stipulated that I will endeavor to check all your correction work myself, which you will work out together in the kitchen in the evenings, and then correct the corrections together with you if this should be necessary. What is now required, however, are some necessities which have been considered in detail by our committee in accordance with the present and future circumstances, and which you should also insert as amendments in the statutes under Art. 510 and in the bylaws under Art. 1110. The text should read as follows. If the membership of a core group member, SKG member, passive member, or a member of another FIGU grouping is terminated for any work-related family, official, illness, accident, place of residence, or other private reasons, as well as for the impossibility to fulfill duties which in no way comply with the statutes Art. 5.1.9 or Articles of Association Art. 11.1.9. Then membership can be taken up and continued immediately at any time without further conditions and without a new qualifying and probationary period after amendment regulation of the membership resignation resolution. A further amendment is pending in relation to the statutes Art. 4.1 whereby Art 1 needs to be reworded and inserted as follows. A person to be admitted as a KG-49 member or as a SKG member is required to make himself useful as a candidate. Member for 1 year at the given times of the meetings, or also between these times, as far as possible in a collaborative way in the FIGU Center. After that, only an application as KG-49 member or SKG member should be possible. If the application for membership is approved by a General Assembly, provisional membership will then be granted for a period of 1 year, after which a decision can be taken on whether to accept or reject the application for membership of KG-49 or SKG. Similarly, this provision also applies to the bylaws, consequently these must be used in Art. 7.1 in a stated and amended manner. Further discussions were held regarding all the work that until now has been in Bernadette's area of production, but now some necessary changes need to be considered that will relieve Bernadette's workload and ensure a better division of labor, as well as giving her the opportunity to use her recovery time to fully regain her health, energy, and strength. Accordingly, it is found and ordered that the following shall henceforth apply. 1. All monthly, 3 monthly publication organs/periodicals and all sporadically appearing publications are in future to be produced and completed by you, Edouard, but in the course of time this work is to be transferred to the responsibility of younger and in this respect suitable FIGU members who can belong to the core group membership or to the passive membership. 2. The receipt of literary works such as articles, essays, reports, teaching materials, etc., as well as linguistic works of art in verse, rhyme, or in a special rhythm for the FIGU periodical Wassermannzeit from external and internal authorships are to be submitted to the Wassermannzeit editorial office, redaction at FIGU.org. 3. As per the decision of the General Assembly on the 6th of October 2018, Bernadette will continue to be fully responsible for all correspondence and the drafting, finishing and printing of small publications and books, etc. 4. According to the decision of the General Assembly on the 6th of October 2018, Bernadette remains FIGU actuary with all her duties, as Barbara was also appointed as second actuary and actuary's assistant. 5. for editorial meetings to be held to determine literary works made available to FIGU, such as manuscripts, articles, and other contributions, which are intended for editing into final form for publication and are due for editing, namely for all FIGU publication organs. Excluded from this are works for the Wasser Man Zeit periodicals, which explicitly concern the WZ editorial office. A new fixed editorial group is to be formed, which Christian is henceforth to head. Furthermore, 3 other important matters were discussed, which, however, shall not be mentioned openly, but only submitted to you, whereby they are.
All this will change a few things, but I am sure there will be no problem in this regard.
English translation, 712th Contact Part 3, Wednesday, the 28th of November 2018, 9:57 hours.
But then there are some other things to consider, which I will discuss with you privately. But first I want to mention that Bernadette should be anxious to illustrate your name Billy with a picture of Billy the Kid, which you received in Tehran and Persia through Judy Reed from Los Angeles. That's because there was no stopping you, and you wanted to know what life story was really about Billy the Kid. Consequently, at your request, you were able to go back in time with my father to Billy the Kid and meet him. When my father told you that one day in the future you would be compared to him, and thus be given the name Billy, which would then become known worldwide as a result of your mission.
In principle, I have no objection to including the image of Billy the Kid in my biography, if it is explained that he was not the killer he was made out to be, because he was a completely different human being than he was falsely made out to be after his murder by the killer sheriff Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett, and by enemies and fans and know-it-alls, etc. And the whole thing is then made into a legend. And the whole thing was then also hyped up as a legend. He may have shot a human being in self-defense, who then died of the injury, but he was not a killer. He was a young man who acted only in self-defense and unintentionally shot a man armed with a knife, who wanted to stab him in the stomach in a scuffle. But you yourself know the story of Billy the Kid. So I think it is better if you tell it yourself as your father Svath described it, because he recorded everything very precisely in his annals, as you once said. Also important would be the gravestone, on the alleged grave of Billy the Kid, by which his fans are misled.
I would like to do that, because I think that your objection is justified, but I only want to explain what is necessary, because the whole life story of Billy the Kid would lead too far, which is supposed to be largely known through exact traditions, but does not correspond to the truth, and therefore does not need to be shown in detail by me. Nevertheless, my elaboration will take some time, whereby I will also weave in repetitions, because in order to clarify everything even to a certain extent, some explanations are required. I will also not present what is to be explained in a logical manner according to the chronological sequence of events, as these correspond to my father's records, but simply as they occur to me in the course of the discussion. Contrary to the myths and legends surrounding William Henry McCarty, Billy the Kid, as his real name was, I must declare that the stories that were already circulating widely during his lifetime were, on the whole, pure lies and thus, already from the ground up, fundamentally false chronological falsifications and malicious slander, which were invented and contrived out of pure malice against Billy the Kid and which innocently degraded him to the status of a murderous criminal, or elevated him to the status of a hero even during his lifetime. When the so-called Wild West was settled by immigrants, it was an era of evil violence, complacency, and greed for land and wealth, for which not only criminal acts were part of the agenda, but also serious crimes up to and including murder. And such actions and deeds emanated from simple human beings immigrating from Europe and other countries, who settled in the Wild West and in villages and towns as citizens and, of course, also fathered offspring. Simple farmers as well as cattle breeders, so-called ranchers, with large herds of cattle also practiced violence in order to gain land, money, and wealth, whereby murder and manslaughter and cattle wars were also not uncommon. as well as corruption, criminality, and crime in administrations in all states, villages, and towns from which the simple and industrious populations had to suffer. And the fact that human beings developed into criminals and offenders out of these conditions was an inevitable consequence, as was also the emergence of injustice and vindictiveness, theft, bank robbery, prostitution, slavery, as well as murder and manslaughter, etc., from which rewards were also offered for the capture of wanted criminals in the form of bounties and with the indication dead or alive. This attracted many conscienceless and money-hungry people who delighted in killing human beings, such as self-appointed lawmen, sheriffs and bounty hunters, or those hired by ranchers, village, and town councils to hunt down delinquents far and wide, bring them to justice, or simply shoot them in cold blood without delay. And that many of these hired or officially elected lawmen were nothing other than cold-blooded and passionate killers is also known from the generally well and truthfully documented stories of many gunslingers from the Wild West, such as Wild Bill Hickok, John Wesley Hardin, and Wyatt Earp, etc. Their stories, according to my father's fath, are based on very precise clarifications of correctness, as they were also recorded chronologically. This, however, is completely contrary to the lies, myths, and slanderous legends surrounding Billy the Kid, who, as precise clarifications by my father have shown, was slanderously declared to be a killer and criminal due to his youth and membership of murder and cattle-rustling gangs. His bad reputation was further enhanced by the fact that he always defended himself against unjustly inflicted accusations and injustices by offensive words and speeches, which was greatly resented by all his enemies and used to make him all the more a lawbreaker and hounded by dubious lawmen, sheriffs, and unscrupulous, cold-blooded bounty hunters, among whom was also Pat Garrett, by lies and slander. And that Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett had known and hated the young Billy the Kid for a long time and disliked him from the ground up on the one hand, but also because the boy was friends with Juanita Gutierrez, whom Garrett later married, no one knew, because to the contrary, Garrett spread the rumor that he was good friends with the young William McCarthy. So Pat Garrett was looking for a way to kill the boy in a legal manner, even before he was appointed sheriff in Lincoln County, New Mexico, and he indulged in bounty hunting. At a later date, Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett then went to Washington to seek reappointment to his appointed office. The then U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt then appointed him to the post of Collector of Customs in El Paso. But contrary to all the lies as spread at the time by Garrett himself, and also later by others and ever since, Garrett and Roosevelt were not friends in any way and were not even close acquaintances. Just as Pat Garrett spread this lie about his alleged friendship with Roosevelt, he did the same with regard to the killer stories which he attributed to Billy the Kid, and in doing so, as sheriff, also personally falsified various offices, etc., in their documents and written statements, etc., or had his lying and slanderous truth-distorting distortions carried out by dishonest officials, etc., who were paid by him or bribed with money. In the meantime, when he was doing his dastardly, conniving and murderous business elsewhere than around Billy the Kid, he made a name for himself when he became a buffalo hunter, also murdering a hunting competitor named Joe Briscoe. In Fort Sumner, New Mexico, Garrett then married a young woman named Juanita Gutierrez, who was only a year older than Billy the Kid, with whom she maintained good friendship, but which greatly displeased her intensely jealous and suspicious husband, causing hostility and hatred to surge up in him. This woman, however, then died in childbirth, her death having been insidiously brought about by Garrett, who shortly before the birth had given her an apple pulp of small deadly apples of a manchineel tree. The reason for this was, on the one hand, his jealousy and her friendship with Billy the Kid, and, on the other hand, because in her 8th month of pregnancy she heard several times during his sleep the speeches he made in his dreams. and thereby betrayed himself to her concerning his secret of his murderousness and his intrigues and lying and slanderous machinations against Billy the Kid. And when she confronted her husband Pat Garrett and threatened to report her knowledge to the courts, she sealed her own fate, for he immediately decided for his own safety to kill her at the first opportunity. William Henry McCarthy, however, was the subject of all sorts of atrocious stories of thievery and murder early in his young life, and Pat Garrett was constantly trying to further these and also put him in situations where he was shot and killed. In this, Garrett not infrequently participated in a hidden and clandestine way in the background, practicing his deadly craft, and then blaming the murders he committed on the boy, as you are wont to say when someone does something which he then denies and claims that another person did it. Patrick Garrett took a wicked pleasure in sadistically torturing the boy morally and psychologically and acting this out in a dastardly, vile, mean, vile, and hurtful manner, and then murdering him when the opportunity arose. In this way, the act of self-defense that Billy the Kid was forced to commit in Arizona became, over time, an alleged series of murders with 21 victims shot by the boy. Unfortunately, Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett managed to keep up his criminal face of killing, scheming, lying, and slandering until one day, after many years, an old friend who knew the real truth regarding Billy the Kid and the infamous machinations of Pat Garrett decided to take revenge for his murdered friend. Subsequently, unable to carry out the revenge due to his age, he hired a paid hitman to shoot Garrett and keep quiet about the reason for the killing. So I will now only state the true facts as they are listed in my father's annals and describe everything in relation to Billy the Kid and his acts of murder as they really were, and largely took place in a completely different way to how they were recorded chronologically and also falsified in legends. I will also begin my interpretation with the gravestone and the false grave. The gravestone at Fort Sumner in New Mexico, which secures a grave behind heavy iron bars, has nothing to do with Billy the Kid, because his last earthly resting place can no longer be determined or located, because his bones were washed away from the cemetery at Fort Sumner in 1904 when the Pecos River flooded. Moreover, the soldiers' bones buried in the cemetery were also moved when the military base there was abandoned, although the bones of Billy the Kid had already been moved from the grave at that time, as my father Svath had already clarified without any doubt. It cannot be said, however, whether these bones were found again at all, for nothing was known about this and nothing could be clarified, for as a result of the mixing of the collected bones they could no longer be identified and assigned to any persons. Inevitably, they were mixed with many other bones and reburied after the nearby Pecos River had released some of them after the flooding and reburial had also taken place. When the gravestone for Billy the Kid was erected in the 1930s, chosen by a commission and a decision was made between 4 different possible burial sites, the choice fell on a 5th site, the one where the gravesite was built. The inscription on the gravestone is of legendary origin, as are many other things, but especially the story of Billy the Kid, which is nothing more than an effectively fictitious and untruthful legend or myth, which has circulated up to the present day and portrays Billy the Kid as a multiple murderer, which in truth he was not, as is clearly refuted by my father's records, because in the past he witnessed every single fatal act by Billy the Kid at the respective time of the events on the spot as a direct observer. Billy the Kid's mother was Catherine McCarty, who lived first in Coffeyville, Kansas, and then in Pueblo, Colorado. Because she suffered from consumption and tuberculosis, she moved to a milder climate, namely to Silver City in New Mexico, where she died after a short time on the 16th of September 1874 as a result of her incurable disease. William Henry McCarthy, a.k.a. Billy the Kid, had an older brother named Joseph. Consequently, he was born the second son of Irish Protestant immigrants on the 24th of December in 1862, little more than 3 years later than has been deliberately conspiratorially claimed since his death. In truth, the correct date of birth was maliciously and purposefully falsified to the 23rd of September 1859 on the one hand and the 23rd of November 1859 on the other by underhand machinations of Sheriff Patrick Floyd Garrett. His reason for doing so was so that he, Garrett, could claim that he had not shot a minor regarding Billy the Kid, but a grown man who had been a multiple killer. But when he murdered him on the 14th of July, 1881, the boy was not 21, but only 18 and a half years old. But it was not only Sheriff Pat Garrett who falsified chronological records and spread lies and slander about Billy the Kid, because even after his murder, people continued to lie and slander. And the lying and slandering, as well as the creation of myths and legends, even reached a climax when two men came forward and mendaciously claimed that Billy the Kid had, in fact, because he and Sheriff Patrick Floyd Garrett had allegedly been best friends, not been murdered by Garrett, but had been spared by him and brought to safety. Both men claimed that they were, in fact, Billy the Kid, who had been spared by Pat Garrett, but who had really and actually been murdered with 2 shots from the killer sheriff's gun, as my father Svath had witnessed observantly, and had also afterwards undoubtedly established the death of Billy the Kid. However, such lies, slanders, and allegations are not uncommon among Earth humans, as is also demonstrable in earthly human history, as for example with the Tsar's children, especially Anastasia and Alexei, who allegedly caused the murder of the Tsar's family on the 17th of July, 1918, in the course of the Russian Revolution. Anastasia is said to have fled to the USA and lived from then on as Anna Anderson. But this person was a certain Franziska Anna Częstkowska, who was born in West Prussia in 1896, and had been missing since March 1920 because she had absconded to America and never reported again. In addition to this woman, other women also claimed to be Anastasia Romanov, such as Eugenia Smith and Eleonora Albertawa Kruger, as well as Nadezhda Ivanova Vasilyeva, all of whom were believed by many Earth humans. This was also the case with the Tsar's son Alexei, for he too had various revenants, note Billy. Revenant = usually a spirit resurrected from death, or restless, wandering spirit of a deceased person, such as the triple agent Michael Goleniewski, who had himself proclaimed the real Tsarevich Alexei by a Warsaw newspaper in 1927, as well as a Eugene Nikolaevich Ivanov, whose real name was Ernest Veerman, and who appeared as the first Alexei Tammet note, Tammet = human being. Billy, Tammet = a human being with a so-called insular talent, such as the gift of being able to solve mathematical problems and calculations extraordinarily quickly, whereby the results can be reproduced accurately to 100 decimal places. And Alexander Savin also boasted of being Alexei before he was arrested by the Soviet secret police in 1928. Exactly such cases of reincarnation often occur among Earth humans, the best known being those in which religious sectarian backgrounds are the causes and Earth humans pose as revenants of their religious originators or their emissaries, etc., and allow themselves to be worshipped by their believers. And this is the case with all religions, as you know, whereby a great deal of stupidity, delusion, and lack of understanding as well as ignorance is involved in all of them. And the revenants have no idea whatsoever that a reincarnation is absolutely impossible according to their meaning. Only those Earth humans who consciously pretend to be revenants in a deceptive way, and thus not in a religiously delusional way, are actually aware of their deception, whereas the kind of religious revenants are usually addicted to delusion up to forms of schizophrenia. But now I have digressed. For with regard to the 2 revenants mentioned in relation to Billy the Kid, their names are still to be mentioned, such as a certain Ollie Partridge William Roberts, also called Brushy Billy, who died in Hiko, Texas on the 27th of December 1950, as well as a certain John Miller, who ultimately died in Prescott, Arizona on the 7th of November 1937 and was buried in Pioneer Home Cemetery. So in the course of time, these two persons claimed that they were in fact Billy the Kid and had not been shot by Sheriff Patrick Floyd Garrett because he had been their best friend and had therefore let them go, so that instead of burying them or their body, he had buried that of a strange young man and collected the bounty. What is further listed in my father's annals refers to the fact that Billy the Kid later gave himself other names, such as William Henry Bonney, although he rarely called himself William Antrim, after his stepfather, William Henry Antrim, whom his mother married because her husband had been killed in the Civil War. Billy the Kid, my father recorded in his notes, was not a stone-cold murderer, but a very sympathetic young man who was often abused by his stepfather, William Henry Antrim, viciously beaten up, constantly reviled, and also treated unfairly as a victim by other elements who resented him. My father, Svat, in his annals, judged him to be a very helpful young man, who was also attracted to those fellows who were good to him, which he paid with sincere attachment and affection and sincere thanks. He was also willing to work, industrious, honest, and thanked his employers for the kindness they showed him. He valued sincere friendship highly. Consequently, he also always went out of his way for his friends and never left them unnoticed when they were in need of his help. In reality, he was neither malicious nor vengeful, and also did not kill 21 human beings, as was always claimed during his lifetime and also after his murder, whereby this legend lie has survived until today. In truth, he killed only one man, but he did not murder him, but shot him in the stomach in self-defense, thereby protecting his own life, as my father was able to clarify without any doubt. In this case, he was not only threatened, but compellingly faced with the choice of losing his life while still a young man, or fighting back to avoid being killed himself because the adversary was jaded and callous to stab Billy the Kid. Billy was an adolescent young man who on the one hand was very eager to learn and inquisitive. Consequently, he learned a lot where he could, which is why he was also fluent in Spanish and knew how to read and write, unlike most of his age and background. Thus, despite his young years, he was an educated young man, which was also evidenced by letters from him to Texas Governor Lew Wallace, with whom he was negotiating a pardon. The governor's secretary also said that Billy the Kid's writing was so expressive, eloquent, educated, and eloquent, and also beautiful, that it was worth dreaming about. He also told a friend that this boy could have become something great if, on the one hand, he had been able to remain in his mother's care and had not been exposed in his youth to a violent, crude, and criminal world, and above all, if he had not been innocently persecuted, hunted by criminal sheriffs, and murdered by Pat Garrett, whom he knew with certainty to be nothing other than a passionate killer. On the other hand, it was never in the mind of Billy the Kid to want to cope with his life as a lawbreaker, just as he did not seek his own advantages as such, which is why he merely defended himself against injustice and sought to do justice in his own way. And because he was attacked several times and others were willing to kill him, it unfortunately happened that he had to defend his life and defend it in self-defense in a deadly way. This, however, was exactly the opposite of what all those who represented the law or were otherwise on its side, but who in truth were themselves more inclined to crime and criminality than to honesty and correct citizenship, were striving for. And it was these who criminalized Billy the Kid and discriminated against him as a criminal and killer, and ensured that he was pursued and hunted by lawmen who were often in truth nothing more than bounty hunters or bounty killers and made a lot of money with their bloody trade. This, while others admired Billy the Kid, exalted him and tried to make him into something better than he really was on the one hand, and on the other hand did not want to be through exaggerated praise, undeserved emphasis, and undue importance, giving him undue value. With regard to all the many murders attributed to him, it was the case that these were imputed to him on the basis of his repeated escapes from the law, which, however, were really only based on pure suspicions and could, of course, never be proven against him. He was also subsequently convicted in absentia as a murderer on the 17th of August, 1877. With regard to his involvement in criminal gangs, etc., he was never one of those gang members who murdered, for he always refrained from doing so and only acted as if he were shooting at human beings, although in truth he only shot into the air without exception in such actions. As my father Svath was able to ascertain for himself with absolute clarity when he observed every single case at the respective places of the events and checked everything. The fact is that in the autumn of 1871 at Fort Grant in Arizona, in the George Adkins saloon, where he called himself Henry Antrim, he severely wounded with a revolver shot a local blacksmith named Frank Windy Cahill, who had immigrated from Galway, Ireland, because he was involved in a brawl with him and the latter wanted to stab him. This was the first man Billy the Kid shot down when he was still a minor, which was also officially confirmed, and it was also the last and only man to be killed by him. In this incident, numerous persons also testified that he had acted in self-defense and that he had only defended his life, while other eyewitnesses who were not well disposed towards him accused him of murder against all truth and lied that the Hufschmidt had been unarmed and had been shot down without resistance. However, when my father Svath, in retrospect or in the past, personally observed the incident, he realized the truth and that the blacksmith was very much armed and was about to plunge a large knife into the stomach of Billy the Kid, also shouting that he was going to kill him. To this my father wrote that when the blacksmith was about to bring his raised and knife-armed fist down on the boy lying on the ground, whom he had already knocked to the ground and who was lying defenseless on the ground, he shouted, "Now, you dog, I'll stab you, note Billy, =, now, you dog, I'll stab you!" This, of course, struck fear into the boy and caused him, as if in a trance of self-preservation, to reach for his revolver, which he carried in his waistband, and shoot the man in the stomach. The knife thrust by the man against him would indeed have been fatal, and therefore not only life-threatening, as my father was able to judge after a precise clarification, as his records also clearly show, as well, that the eyewitnesses, who were friends of the blacksmith, concealed this dangerous knife attack of the blacksmith and also removed the knife, in order to then accuse Billy the Kid of murder with lies and false statements, who could not do anything against the brawny man and against whose knife thrust he would have had no chance of survival. Cahill, the farrier, was a brawny man of about 180 centimeters in height and weighed over 100 kilos, while Billy the Kid was only about 160 centimeters tall and weighed no more than about 65 kilos, and who, moreover, had been attacked and insulted by the farrier several times before the brawl because he did not like Billy. On this momentous day, however, Cahill knocked Billy the Kid to the ground and called him a pimp and the son of a whore and a slut because he was dressed not like a native or a cowboy, but like a city slicker. The vicious name-calling set the boy on fire, so he also called the blacksmith names and called him Dog Son, who then attacked Billy, kicked and punched him violently, resulting in a fight, which led to the dangerous knife attack by Cahill, which resulted in the latter being severely shot in the stomach, which later proved fatal for him in hospital. However, before Cahill died in hospital, he vehemently denied that he had viciously and shamefully insulted, attacked and attempted to murder with a knife Billy the Kid who, after being shot, was able to crawl out from under the heavy-set blacksmith who had fallen on top of him, quickly rise and flee from the saloon and from the mob who were chasing him. Despite the lies of the eyewitnesses, however, he did not have to explain himself and answer to a court of law, and that was because he never returned to the state of Arizona. Billy the Kid also absconded several times when he was arrested and imprisoned. Hours, he also changed his name to William H. Bonney. Hours, he was also called a killer and a criminal. Hours, he was constantly pursued by law enforcement officers such as sheriffs. Hours, he was hunted down like a wild animal. This was also the case with Sheriff Pat Garrett, who on the one hand was never a friend of Billy the Kid, and on the other hand was a money-hungry bounty hunter and passionate killer, as was common in the so-called Wild West of the time, which meant that many so-called lawmen and official sheriffs were effective killers whose joy and purpose in life was to mercilessly and consciencelessly murder human beings. This corresponded to a degeneracy that has remained with many lawmen. Sheriffs and police officers in various states of the USA to this day, just as bounty hunting is still commonplace in the USA today, albeit in a modified form. Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid were not cut from the same cloth, as you sometimes say on certain occasions, because it is correct to say, according to my father's notes, that they both knew each other. But this acquaintance through Garrett consisted of a dislike for the young William Henry McCarty alias Billy the Kid, so that there was no friendship, but a state of dislike and hatred, which, however, emanated unilaterally from Garrett, which put an extremely heavy strain on Billy. Garrett was constantly following Billy the Kid, sneaking up behind him and repeatedly causing bad situations in order to harm him and drive him into conflicts. This also happened after Pat Garrett became Lincoln County Sheriff in 1880, and he hunted him down mercilessly. After which the boy fled to Mexico but soon returned, after which Patrick Floyd Garrett arrested him once again, this time with witnesses present so he could not just shoot him without fighting back. On the 13th of April, 1881, Billy the Kid was then sentenced to death by the Lincoln District Court, with Garrett contributing lies and slander. The death sentence, however, was not enough for Pat Garrett, so he deviously freed the condemned man in prison and let him escape, so that he could hunt him down again and finally kill him himself in his hatred. The arranged escape, however, did not succeed in the way he wanted, because unexpectedly 2 sheriffs confronted him and Billy the Kid, who also took up the chase but were then shot by Pat Garrett because they had recognized him and also wanted to hand him over to justice as an escape helper or, if necessary, kill him. Of course, it could not be otherwise than that Garrett blamed the 2 murders on Billy the Kid, who, as an escapee from prison, was of course unarmed. And also this time the escape of William Henry McCarty led to Mexico, where he was murdered by Garrett on the 15th of July, 1881 with 2 shots in the back, which he boasted about afterwards and declared publicly that he had shot him without warning, namely when Billy the Kid left his bedroom unarmed and half-dressed to get something to drink. The lust for murder and the joy of murder early in Pat Garrett's life also resulted in the fact that he not only shot Billy the Kid without warning, but also 2 other men before him, whom he had supposedly mistaken for Billy and collected a bounty on, but buried them himself. But the truth was that he killed the men, just to pursue the joy of his passion for murder and to collect the reward. Then when he viciously shot Billy the Kid in cold blood, the truth was basically that Billy had been denied a fair, honest trial in every single case all those times before, but was convicted of being a murderer and a rustler, etc., despite his proclaimed innocence through him. And that this was so was known to many righteous people. Consequently, his death was also received with sadness and anger, precisely by those many people who knew him and his true nature and actions really well, and also knew that the Sheriff Pat Garrett was a vicious, cold-blooded and money-hungry bounty hunter and passionate serial killer, that is to say, a killer. So it also turned out that he was notorious in this respect, and he was also treated like a leper by the righteous population. Effectively, Billy the Kid was an industrious, young, honest, and decent man. Consequently, he also worked for cattle ranchers, such as one named John Chisholm, another named Lawrence G. Murphy, and later for an English rancher whose name was John Tunstall, but who was then murdered in what was called the Lincoln County Cattle War, aided and abetted by the corrupt official of the city of Lincoln. When it came to avenging Tunstall's death, Billy the Kid also took part as a follower, though, as usual, he refrained from being an avenger and killing himself. The avenging murderers were two men, with whom Billy the Kid also stayed on and went with them to Steel Springs, New Mexico, where the two murderers were shot in his presence on the 9th of March, 1878. He was only involved as a follower without any personal involvement, as in all other cases in which he was slanderously accused of involvement in murders. And this was also the case when the corrupt sheriff William Brady and his deputy and assistant George Hindman were shot in Lincoln on the 1st of April, 1878, after they had been lured into an ambush. Also, when a man named Buckshot Roberts was killed in a shootout at Blazer's Mill on the 4th of April, Billy the Kid was present. But as always before, he was as uninvolved in the man's death as he was in the deaths of other human beings in the decisive battle of the Lincoln County War from the 15th to 19th of July, 1878. As always, he had only fired blindly into the air to keep up the pretense of also killing, in order to maintain comradeship with the gang members and to be seen as an equal. In return, however, the reward of certain public figures was that he became more and more known as a conscienceless gunman and killer, and was thus hounded all over the country by killer-happy and money-hungry lawmen, sheriffs, and bounty hunters. Also by the killer Patrick Floyd Jarvis Garrett, who was eventually elected sheriff and specifically set upon Billy the Kid, whom he ultimately murdered in an insidious manner. Pat Garrett himself was also later murdered on the 28th of February, 1908, near Las Cruces, New Mexico, by a hired killer named Jesse Wayne Brazel. Finally, it is important to note that Billy the Kid was a young man who was often abused and argued with by his stepfather, which led him to learn to play cards in saloons at an early age, where he also had to defend himself against a blacksmith who tried to stab him. The legend that he was 12 years old at the time and stabbed the man is only true insofar as the man had previously insulted his mother, whom the boy adored, as a whore and slut. On the one hand, he was already 15 years old at the time, on the 17th of August, 1877, and on the other hand, he had not stabbed the blacksmith but shot him in the stomach in self-defense, after which he died in a hospital. Billy the Kid was actually constantly on the run until his violent death, but not so involved in shootings that he would have had to kill. He also saved settler families from Indians, joined gangs without ever killing any other human beings, also stole cattle because he was not paid his due wages for the work he had done and was therefore innocently sentenced to death. The last time he escaped from prison with the help of his nemesis, Sheriff Pat Garrett, the latter finally used the opportunity to shoot him in an underhanded manner. How the whole thing happened was described in detail by the murderer himself in a book, because he wrote that Billy the Kid stepped out of the room of his Mexican mistress, Celsa Gutierrez, to go over to the house of his friend Pete Maxwell to get something there. As he did so, he had dimly spotted two figures on the veranda and asked in Spanish, which he knew well, ¿Quién es? ¿Quién es? Note equal sign, who is there? But there was only his assassin waiting and lurking, who struck him down with 2 shots, killing him. After all the very accurate clarifications made by my father Svath, not many bodies went to the account of Billy the Kid, but only the blacksmith Frank Windy Cahill, whom he effectively shot in self-defense. This was clearly clarified by my father. However, tall tales and tall legends speak of 21 human beings whom he is said to have killed, while others assume 9, but 4 others are said to be genuine and given, 2 of which are said to have been acts of self-defense. But none of this corresponds to the truth, because in the life of Billy the Kid, according to my father's extremely precise clarifications, only one human being was killed by him, namely the blacksmith. It is therefore clear that all the stories that have been told since the death of William Henry McCarthy and have become legend are in fact untrue. Lies, fictions, and fantasy, the only thing that is certain being that the young man Billy the Kid was already made into a legend during his lifetime, and then even more so after his death. What has been said corresponds to what I have read in my father's Svath Annals, in which he has meticulously described what he observed. Experienced, learned, and recorded and handed down with his written notes through his investigations and clarifications in the past, on the spot of what happened to Billy the Kid. And what is also to be mentioned is the content of a letter from a gang member and friend of Billy the Kid, which he wrote to Pat Garrett, and also sent to the city and court officials as well as to various publications, but which was never heeded and not publicly published in order to promote the concealment of the truth and the profit-making legend. Jesse Evans, a former gang member, had his letter typeset and printed in a small workshop in 1884 and also distributed to people on the streets in various places. But to no avail, because as a friend of Billy the Kid and a member of a gang, Jesse Evans's statements were not accepted. My father was able to get hold of one of these letters and has kept it, which I have had translated for you and now want to read to you.
Pat Garrett, you are the murderer of Billy the Kid.
The undeniable fact is that you, Sheriff Pat Garrett, are the real criminal behind the story of William Henry McCarthy, alias Billy the Kid, because you, as a killer and bounty hunter, murdered him out of jealousy and hatred. I say this to you, Garrett, I, Jesse Evans, for I have been an eyewitness on several occasions when you, Garrett, have murdered and attributed these acts of murder to Billy the Kid. Pat Garrett, I accuse you of claiming that Billy the Kid murdered 21 human beings, even stabbing his first victim at the age of 12, which, like all your lies, is untrue. You know very well that Billy shot the man in self-defense. The blacksmith called Frank Windy Cahill when he tried to kill him with a knife, after which he later died, and Billy was already 15 years old at the time. As a friend of Billy's, I always knew that he was not a murderer, even if he did join our gang and shoot wildly, but never at human beings, only aimlessly into the air. The lies that Billy killed and murdered are all your fault, Garrett, because you, Pat Garrett, are the one who spread them in the first place and then again and again for years, as well as all the other monstrous untruths that were spread everywhere by you, until many believed your lies and an evil legend was created. And you, Garrett, did this only out of ardent jealousy and malicious hatred, because Billy had a friendship with your lover, Juanita Gutierrez, 2 years younger than you, whom you, Pat, wanted as your wife and impregnated her, after which you also married her in 1877. But after only a few months, she died in strange circumstances in the miscarriage of her child. After that, Garrett, you married her sister, Apolinaria Gutierrez, who was a year younger, and with whom you also began an intimate relationship early on. Garrett, you were the ringleader of the worst of the lies and falsehoods that you not only spread about Billy the Kid, but also many others who are still in bondage to you or are acquaintances or friends of yours, as well as those who are acquaintances and friends of those you murdered and then claimed that they were killed by Billy, including the corrupt Sheriff William Brady and his equally corrupt Deputy George Hindman, as well as several other people who murdered, who you then ambushed and shot, and also blamed those acts on Billy, which he never had anything to do with. And because of all your lies, Garrett, Billy became the subject of an unparalleled tall tale and legend. Then, Garrett, when you were appointed sheriff of Lincoln County, even though you were a killer and a bounty hunter, you spread the lie far and wide that Billy the Kid was your best friend, but that as a lawman, you had no right to take that friendship into account, and therefore had to bring the lawbreaker to justice. This, in order to conceal the fact that you were bottomlessly jealous of him, hated him viciously, and therefore wanted to murder him. Therefore you, Garrett, discredited him more and more as an outlaw and murderer, and did everything to be able to shoot him in self-defense one day. Then, when you were appointed sheriff and set upon Billy, your aspirations were fulfilled, for you were now able to kill him legally. And knowing that Billy was not yet an adult, but still a boy, you claimed that he was older and already an adult. Since the unrest and lawlessness in Lincoln County were great, and the population decided to put an end to this goings-on, you, Garrett, were finally elected sheriff on January 1st, 1880, despite your bad reputation as a bounty hunter, or precisely because of it, and assigned to hunt down and kill Billy the Kid. By then, several other lawmen of your ilk had attempted this, who were also, like yourself, Garrett, lawmen, only by virtue of the sheriff's badge, but in reality were killers and bounty hunters who murdered far and wide. So you, Garrett, hunted Billy until you finally, when he was completely unarmed and drunk asleep, murdered him with 2 shots on the 14th of July, 1881, which I can testify to because I witnessed it myself, but had to flee because you had your personal killer dogs, devoted to you, posted all around, and you were also after me and wanted to kill me as well. But since the killing of a boy who has not yet grown up does not conform to our laws of the land but is tantamount to outright murder, you, Garrett, began with a glorification of your nefarious deed to Billy. You did not want to be seen as a conscienceless, vile, reprehensible, and unscrupulous murderer of your alleged friend, which is why you, Garrett, spread the lie that Billy was armed. But with that and many other lies, you, Garrett, caused even worse stories about Billy to be circulated and ultimately 21 murders to be blamed on him, for which were never held accountable, which is why I will take revenge on you for your murder of Billy. And if I cannot do it myself, then sooner or later I will find and pay someone to judge you, you murderer of my friend Billy, and bring justice. But apart from that, the fact is that you still claim and lie today that you shot your supposed best friend in self-defense because he was a multiple horrible murderer, and as a lawman, you were compelled to kill him because he pointed his gun at you, Garrett, and supposedly wanted to shoot you. But Billy would never have done that because he was not a murderer. Thus, with this vile lie, you, Garrett, believed that his murder would not look like a ruthless and cold-blooded act, which it was, as I observed for myself. You, Garrett, years before the murder of my friend Billy, whose name was William Henry McCarty, spread outrageous false accusations against him, accusing him of multiple murders, which he was never guilty of, but which you actually committed yourself. This led to further legends about the number of alleged murders around him, which you, Garrett, have raised to a total of 21, and Billy is therefore supposed to have killed so many human beings, which he never did. But how malicious and brazen you are, Garrett, and how you spread these and other lies and untruths about Billy and imputed wicked monstrosities to him, and thereby destroyed his young life, is also shown by the lies that have been spread and written about him since his murder by you. Also that Billy was born on the 23rd of November, 1859, is nothing but a lie, for he was born on the 24th of December, 1862, as his mother once told me in person. The 23rd of November 1859, however, was only chosen by you, Garrett, because Billy would then already have been 21 years old at the time of his murder, and otherwise it would have become known that you had shot an 18-year-old and that you, Garrett, had known this. Again, I say that Billy, to whom you, Garrett, yourself gave the name Billy the Kid early on, was not a murderer. But nevertheless, he died by your assassin's bullet because you had wanted to kill him for years out of hatred and jealousy and were looking for a way to be able to do so with impunity. But that you, Garrett, betrayed yourself and convicted yourself of lying. Namely, that you knew that Billy was still a boy when you called him Billy the Kid, is something that the stupid people have unfortunately not understood. And it must also be clarified that I was also present as a witness in the saloon when Billy defended himself in self-defense and shot the blacksmith named Frank Cahill, who then died. Billy had to defend himself and shoot him in self-defense, because otherwise he would have been killed himself. And I can testify to that because I was also present in the saloon and saw everything when it happened. And all the murders that have been blamed on Billy during his life by you, Garrett, who, contrary to him, are a conscienceless and depraved killer and bounty hunter, he never committed a murder. And though I'm an outlaw, Billy was not even when he ran with our gangs. He was a good human being and my only real friend, which is why I am going to kill you, Garrett, as his killer one day like this, or shoot you, Garrett, down, or if necessary, if I cannot do it, have you, Garrett, killed like you did Billy. And I will do that, even though I may have to wait years to find the opportunity. That, Garrett, I swear to you, I, Jesse Evans, who will kill you or have you killed by others.
This is really all sorts of things, and Svath never told me about this, but it is all very instructive, and it contradicts all the myths and legends and reveals a completely different human being, Billy the Kid, and also a completely different story than has been told and written for some 150 years. On the one hand, your father Svath told me all kinds of things that he himself had experienced in the past, just as Billy the Kid made a few things clear to me during my journey through his past. Because even as a boy I was interested in who he really was, precisely because Svath told me that I would once be compared to Billy, and then be named after him in Persia, which is what actually happened. But perhaps I should say something about the story of Billy the Kid, what really happened in those days in the so-called Wild West with regard to gunslingers and gunfights, and in a completely different way than has always been misrepresented in Western films and gives a completely false picture. That will also take some time to do, if you are not in a hurry, Ptah.
That is not the case. And on the other hand, I will be happy to listen and probably learn a few things in the process, because I myself have had little exposure to the wild days and events in the American West. However, I would now like to suggest to Bernadette that she include in your biography the circumstances of how your surname Billy came about, as well as a page-perfect overall image of Billy the Kid, which was created in 1879 as a ferrotype, which was a common direct positive process in the 19th century to produce a photograph, the only one that could be made by a photographer at the time and which is still distributed page-perfect today. I would also like to have a portrait of him when he was 15 years old, and you were able to meet him together with my father Svath in the past, which was taken 2 years earlier in the spring of 1877 but was not distributed. I will let you find this largely unknown picture of him, after which you only have to copy it and give it to Bernadette. If it pleases you, I will brief you after our conversation so that you can find what you need.
Good, but then I would like to add the photos here in the conversation report as well.
Of course you can, after I instruct you where to find the picture.
I am a bit surprised because despite the many years since Svath took me back in time to Billy, I still remember his face very well. But because of that, maybe you can also learn something from what I want to say. That can be because I knew that we will talk about Billy the Kid today. I looked around and found something on the internet to correct some things that are always misrepresented. However, in the following Wikipedia excerpt that I found, there is something that is not true with regard to the alleged murders, the person and the behavior, etc. concerning Billy the Kid. Also, the truth about gunslingers is not the way they are portrayed. For example, in Wild West novels and in films, which is why I will cite the following, which I found on the internet regarding gunslinger, who is called gunman and gunfighter in English.
Wikipedia excerpt. According to the Random House Historical Dictionary of American Slang, the term first appeared in the 1928 novel Whispering Range by Ernest Haycox. It was soon adopted by other Western writers and became a common term. In the introduction to his novel The Shootist, Glendon Swarthout writes that the words gunslinger or gunfighter are modern terms, and that the more common terms of the time were gunman, pistolier, or shootist. Swarthout was right about the term gunslinger. However, the term gunfighter was already used by Bat Masterson in the newspaper articles he wrote about his experiences in the Wild West. The term hero in this case does not have to correspond to the general understanding of a hero. It is primarily about admiration of a person's skill with a gun, which often became a myth. The brutality involved in the gunfighter's deeds usually recedes into the background. This gave rise to stories and anecdotes about these persons, which are often disputed and usually no longer verifiable. In the early 19th century, human beings were driven to the west of the USA to open up new territories. In order to be able to defend themselves against wild animals and bandits, it soon became common to carry not only a rifle, but also a more compact handgun. After the further development of the revolver by Samuel Colt in 1835 and 1836, and its successful mass production in the 1840s to 1860s, many of the Westerners were soon equipped with a revolver. After the War of Secession, there was quite a high density of revolvers among the American population. A number of legends became famous during this period: Wyatt Earp, Wild Bill Hickok, John Wesley Hardin, or Jesse James. During the range wars in the 1870s and 1880s, many men were involved in bloody disputes over grazing land as employees of a ranch. It was either those who killed on commission or cowboys who became criminals in these turmoils. Note Billy. The following scare legend corresponds to lies and slander. A good example here is Billy the Kid. Originally involved in the Lincoln County Range War, he quite soon became a cold-blooded rustler and murderer. A gunslinger, then, could be an outlaw, a bandit, or a murderer who used the largely unsettled lands of the Wild West to hide out, and from where he regularly carried out raids on the population. Opposing these criminals were the men of the law, like Pat Garrett and Wyatt Earp. Some of them legitimately represented the law as sheriffs or marshals. Others acted as bounty hunters, whose job it was to apprehend the outlaws and either kill them or bring them to justice. These men defended the law on their own or reinterpreted it themselves, either out of revenge or because of their own sense of justice, thus practicing vigilantism cf. Vigilantism. Gunfighters often appeared in connection with the profession of cowboy. The long and hard-working day led to cowboys partying boisterously in the towns and quickly getting into dangerous situations. Not infrequently, shootings were the result. Later, the enthusiasm around the myth of the gunslinger developed into sport shooters who demonstrated their skills with the gun in front of an audience. In Wild West films, a false and dramatized image of the gunslinger is often drawn. Basically, the portrayal in Western films or Western novels is wrong, that the gunslingers often carried their weapon in a holster on a belt that sat low on their hips, so that they could draw the weapon quickly and in a fluid motion. The holsters were usually very plain. Some had receptacles for extra cartridges. They were usually worn at normal belt height. In addition, the so-called cross draw was also preferred by many. The revolver is carried with the grip facing forward on the opposite side of the shooting hand. A right-handed person pulls the weapon out of the holster from left to right. The advantage of this approach was a quick and safe drawing of the weapon, also with a longer barrel. James Butler, Wild Bill Hickok carried his weapons in this way. However, he drew his weapons, 2 engraved Colt Mod. 1851, navy with ivory grips, not in the cross draw but in the twist. The firing hand is turned with the outer surface inwards. The hand is brought very close to the body to the weapon on the same side of the body. That is to say, between the side of the body and the grip of the weapon, with the elbow sticking out very far, and brought forward by a forward movement in which the weapon is turned, at the same time placing the thumb on the hammer and thus also cocking the weapon at the same time. The advantage of this method was that one had the weapon at eye level for aiming. This is also the case with the cross draw, but it is very difficult to cross draw 2 weapons at the same time. Wild Bill Hickok, however, often drew both weapons. In the Western films of the 1950s and 1960s, all the actors carry a peacemaker, the Colt Single Action Army. This weapon, produced from 1873 onwards, was very popular, but did not have the widespread use one might think. Due to the high price for the time, many of the gunslingers used their old percussion revolvers from the Civil War. Some had the muzzle-loading revolvers converted to breech loaders, bored-through drum, modified hammer, removal of the loading press and attachment of a case ejector. This was still far cheaper than buying a new gun. Often the barrel of the old models, which was about 20 centimeters long, was shortened. Also, Colt's Peacemaker, originally only available with a barrel length of 19 centimeters, was later supplied as standard with barrels of 14 or 12 centimeters. Of course, carrying the revolver was sometimes intended to attract attention. For example, Curly Bill Brocious, who made life difficult for Wyatt Earp, was a cowboy who knew how to dress up. It is said that he carried his revolvers in a holster with silver ornaments. Equally remarkable was Jesse James, who carried up to 6 revolvers at a time. In addition to 1 or more revolvers, the equipment often included knives and sometimes pocket pistols, derringers, as well as rifles for shooting at long distances. What distinguished a gunfighter from other human beings at that time was the willingness to fight a conflict with the weapon, the ruthlessness to kill someone, the skillful handling of the weapon quick draw, and also marksmanship, and a certain myth that built up around the person. In Hollywood, the gunslinger is often portrayed in a very exaggerated way, often in a black leather outfit which does not correspond to reality at all. Sure, there were some people who wanted to stand out with certain features. For example, richly decorated holsters or nobly finished weapons, nickel-plated with mother-of-pearl handles. But mostly it was the fashion of the time that determined the look. Wild Bill and Wyatt Earp were in the later years two always well-dressed gentlemen, usually dressed in dark frock coats and wearing expensive hats. Others, such as Billy the Kid, could be seen to have cowboy origins. They usually wore functional clothes that looked rather grubby. Basically, however, it is to be said that a gunslinger could come from any social class, so there is no guideline or uniform scheme into which one could classify this breed of people. There was also no particular pattern of behaviour, as often portrayed: taciturn, smokers, loners. The shootings. In reality, the shootings were very different from what we know from films. It is important to distinguish between spontaneous shootings carried out of a violent temper and real duels. In spontaneous shootouts, for example, in a saloon, both opponents jumped up, drew their weapons and fired at each other. In contrast to the film world, where whole drums were often emptied before one or even both opponents were hit, here the hit rate was very high, as these so-called shootouts were fought out at a distance of less than 2 meters. Classic duels like in the movies existed, but under completely different conditions. Here the opponents were not 50 or 100 meters apart. The distance was often only a few 10 steps high. Barely 5 meters. And here, too, more than one shot was often fired before an opponent was hit. Sometimes also no one was hit and the dispute was still considered settled. It is proven that there were some very good shooters. Among them were Jesse James, Cole Younger, Wild Bill Hickok and John Wesley Hardin. Apart from Hardin, however, these heroes had far fewer deaths on their consciences than they were given credit for. Wild Bill killed 8 human beings in his career. The stories and legends, however, credit him with killing well over 20 opponents. Wyatt Earp, in his role as marshal, preferred to knock out his opponents with his revolver rather than start a gunfight. Well-known historical gunslingers: Clay Allison, 1840 to 1887, Butch Cassidy, 1866, probably 1908, the Dalton brothers Wyatt. Earp, 1848 to 1929, Wild Bill Hickok, 1837 to 1876, Doc Holliday, 1851 or 1852. To 1887, Jesse James, 1847 to 1882. Cole Younger, 1844 to 1916, Bat Masterson, 1853 to 1921, Johnny Ringo, 1850 to 1882, Sundance Kid 1867, probably 1908, Dallas Studenmeyer, 1845 to 1882.
So that is the excerpt from Wikipedia, to which I have nothing more to say on my own, although I now have the following question, which was put to me some time ago and which concerns the following.
Question: how does it now relate to the 194th contact on the 15th of June, 1984?
The following is to be said about this. Probably in the year 2029 there will be a comprehensive withdrawal of all of us play Yaren, after which only sporadic observations of events on Earth will be made. As a result of the disinterest of Earth humans, caused by the enormous religious sectarianism and the false traditions as well as lies and slander integrated into it, it has unfortunately not come to the comprehensive success in all conceivable directions, despite great efforts, which was striven for by the level Arahat Atharsata. And this is because various human beings on Earth, who should have honestly stood up for the mission, have been guilty of deceit, falsehood, personal failure, hegemonic behavior, arrogance, dishonesty, selfishness, egoism, egocentrism, dogmatism, and betrayal, etc., which have prevented the extensive heavy missionary work from being carried out to the extent that it should have been. Too much has gone wrong, as a result of which the Arahat Atharsata level has made changes in the current missionary measures and issued new regulations, which we are not yet fully aware of and therefore also do not yet know what will effectively result. The only thing that is certain so far is that we Playaran will withdraw from Earth and will not continue our efforts to help Earth humanity, who have degenerated to a great extent. Unfortunately, all the very great efforts, as well as the very great financial outlays, toil, the years of manual labor, and as you once said, of drudgery, the stress and the whole tremendous manifold effort have not had a stunning effect, but it has brought such great successes worldwide that many Earth humans have gained a great deal of benefit from it, because on the one hand they have found the way to a correct, healthy and valuable way of life and to a pleasant human existence, as well as a reconciliation with themselves, with life, with their families, with their fellow human beings, and with the whole environment. On the other hand, through the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life, and all your spiritual teaching-related works, a considerable number of psychologically and depressively ill people worldwide have also found their way back into healthy, thought-feeling psychological behavior and have also prevented many suicides. The majority of Earth humans, however, is unfortunately so caught up in delusional religious belief and sectarianism that it is struck abysmally by fear and does not dare in the slightest way to have even a hint of a thought that would be directed against its delusion of faith. Because in bondage to religious delusion, it is believed that even the smallest and not even perceptible, tiniest nuance of a breath regarding a faith-free thought would bring about the most severe divine punishment.
Then something else. Have Yanarara and Zafanatpaniach still not figured out anything regarding the alien and inexplicable tampering with my computer and the associated Zulaide wizardry? Actually, I've been expecting them for a long time, but they have not come so far.
That's what I wanted to tell you about today, because they have now clearly and unequivocally established that all the extraneous influences penetrating your computer are not via the electrical energy network, nor via the light wave network, nor via detectable electromagnetic radio oscillations, nor via light oscillations, nor via any other technically generated electromagnetic oscillations.
Thought I, consequently it can only be such as we have long suspected, namely through which we should not call openly. Otherwise, we shall be declared mad.
Which I think you're right about.
Exactly. And besides, in the last few days I've had my computer messed with again, half a time sign deleted, all my files thrown in the trash, and also made it impossible for me to write anymore. And the latest work is what you see here, which was conjured up for me on a page of that time sign that had been deleted. Voce blasfema, porco sugera nos te matamos. Piero tried to translate the whole thing into German, which he also managed with the help of Erica, because her mother tongue is Portuguese. In the end, however, it turned out that the writing was composed of Portuguese as well as Italian and Serbian words and meant, "You blasphemer, dirty pig, we'll kill you." So it is a death threat conjured into my computer.
The whole thing is getting more and more levelly and, as you say in each case, primitive. However, these energies and their forces that are responsible for this are dangerous and influence faith-sectarian Earth humans who, in their delusion of faith, may again feel called upon by these energies and forces to carry out attacks against your life again, as has already happened 23 times, whereby several core group members were also endangered.
When it is considered by what means these energies and forces are built up, which dominate all those earthlings who are as bondmen, prisoners and slaves of their delusional sectarianism, then it is also to be understood that as God delusionists they have virtually no chance of ever forming a self-created opinion with regard to natural creative reality and its truth. Religious sectarian faith is an erroneous, stupid, and unrealistic illusion related to reality and its truth, just as it is a speculation on miracles and the bringing of salvation, and thus on something for which the human being lacks in every respect a plausible explanation that is capable of understanding and reason. Every religious belief effectively corresponds to an empty, speculative, and unrealizable hope that lacks reason, which, like a poisonous drug, prevents all senses and, from a cognitive psychological point of view, all perception, truth, cognition, and knowledge, and consequently, no reality, and truth-related information processing can take place. Through every religious sect belief, the mental ability of the conscious, the unconscious and the subconscious is extinguished, as well as the ability to form and use rational and rational thoughts and feelings, whereby no optimal intelligent use can come about. It is also impossible for intellect, rationality, and intelligentum to be addressed at all, so that it is not even remotely possible to achieve personal success and a goal of inner peace, inner freedom, justice, contentment, serenity, motivation, victory, real and honest love, or true humanity. Every religious sectarian belief lets the human being fall almost hopelessly into a bondage-like dependency, which equally acts like an addictive drug and absolutely pathological, that is to say, pathological, and serves the human being as a distraction, as this is equally in relation to the pathological use with the electronic digital technology, with regard to the smartphones, applications in the today's abused cyber technology, that is to say, the cybernetically created virtual world or reality, that is to say, illusory world, which in the future will also be followed by the biotechnologies.
Your explanations are absolutely correct, to which I must say that it is very good that you only go public with your explanations through your writings and not directly personally verbally, so also with regard to our conversations, because publicly saying anything would possibly provoke nasty attacks against you from fanatical advocates of the techniques you mentioned.
I know that, and that would also be the case if I were to call religions and their sects what they really are on the street or through the public media, such as people's dulling agents, to which only human beings who are weak in intellect, rationality, and intelligentum can fall prey. And if I say this, or would also say it in public through the media or lectures, then it will not and cannot be understood that I am not attacking the believers as human beings with my explanations, statements, and words, but only their obedient religious sectarian delusion, which is wrong in every case. In principle, I also regard religious delusionists as nothing other than human beings, and I treat and respect them as such, whereby I am also happy to assist and help them according to my possibilities. Despite their belief in God, if they cannot help themselves, are somehow in need or are not capable of self-opinion or self-decision, I am also always happy to bring the effective truth to believers, if this is desired, and to show them the path they can take if they are willing to free themselves from their delusion of faith, although they must then take the first step themselves, which on the one hand is very difficult, but on the other hand is unavoidable, because in this relationship too, the first step must be taken alone, as is the case with every path that wants to be taken. But speaking of treading the path, it occurs to me that on my way in, Langenzingen behind the Horrigenwald on my 6th birthday, I thought up a saying that Bernadette would like to have for my biography. But unfortunately I no longer know the exact wording, which is why I also asked you about it, so that you could look it up in Svath's records.
I did that and also found what I was looking for. The aphorism was listed as follows.
One can always ask in everything if you are not afraid of the answer. Langenzingen, Horagenwald.
Exactly, that is the line. Thanks for your effort, my friend. You said the other day that the U.S. had the most serial killers in the world, to which I think this is not surprising, because U.S. America has a culture that is completely oversaturated with media. And this results from the public media and various crazy religious sects with insane and blatant delusions of God, and from constantly delving into the Bible or quoting the faith. as well as from media oversaturation in terms of entertainment flooding the human senses through media. The mere fact of being in bondage to and listening to an imaginary God, which is common practice among the delusional believers in God among the majority of the U.S. population, causes a disaster of confusion in the human beings of the USA, which manifests itself as tension and struggle against reality and its truth, as a result of which the God, Christ and Savior delusion believers only take time for their delusion of faith relationship, instead of dealing with their personal reality and truth-orientated life and knowledge, and with a righteous way of life in order to really become human beings. Reading magazines and newspapers, watching TV programs, devouring religious radio, and, above all, being addicted to a delusion of faith in God and shifting all responsibility onto an imaginary God is much easier than developing oneself personally as a real human being, and thus to humanity and to the perception of full responsibility for everything and anything by one's own decision through intellect, rationality, and intelligentum. However, none of this can be found in all the delusionists of the USA, but only the opposite. As with regard to a bondage to the like-minded politicians and rulers who are pursuing secret plans for a war, with Russia and China in particular and the intended world domination in their sights. They are not aware of the fact that the part of the U.S. population that is a willing victim of the hegemonic politicians and rulers and is only a stupid and willing tool of their might and warmongering, as well as their hostility towards Russia and China, is already stifled by the delusion of even the slightest hint of reason and rationality. That is why these human beings also say, if you want peace, prepare for war, instead of, if you want peace, avoid all hostility, and practice love and understanding. Furthermore, there is also an obsession with weapons among this U.S. population, or rather a compulsive notion of having to own weapons associated with cowardly fear, which is based on the idea that every U.S. citizen has to defend himself or herself against fellow human beings with weapons in a lethal defensive manner without hesitation. However, if the entire behavior in this regard is considered and analyzed, then it becomes apparent that in these human beings a mental overload syndrome keeps their entire behavioral apparatus in this regard running and continuously causes a chronic exceeding of their psychological and mental stress tolerance, which, however, due to their deeply rooted delusion of God and the resulting irresponsibility, can neither be recognized nor understood, and therefore also not controlled.
What you say is what is real, but as you have just heard, I have been called to pursue an important matter. So you must go back to your workroom, and I must go my way.
What must be then.